This year's topic is digital technologies as drivers of growth and well-being in emerging economies. We are live streaming in YouTube and LinkedIn. For the people in the conference room, we have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. We have the audio speakers at the back. Right now, I'm going to invite Ana Maria Ibanez, our Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge, to open the event with the welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this conference on digital technology and development. And thank you all for joining us, and especially to our invited speakers. Thanks for being here. Currently, there is a great deal of uncertainty over what will happen in the next few years in this topic. Will we see an explosion of intelligence to attain the so-called artificial general intelligence, or is this simply a powerful tool that makes us much more productive? And there are no simple answers for this. The uncertainty about where we will land is still high. Hence, we must put ourselves in the shoes of policymakers. Policymakers want to know how to best take advantage of digital revolution and artificial intelligence in a way that benefits all citizens in Latin America and the Caribbean. They ask about impacts on labor markets, on how digitalization and artificial intelligence will affect our social fabric, and how to leverage artificial intelligence to increase state efficiency, for example. And policymakers may worry about how the digital revolution and AI may widen the gap between developed and developing countries and deepen inequality within their own countries. These are difficult questions, and they are important questions, I would say, because digitalization and artificial intelligence are already changing how we work. At the IDB, we have used artificial intelligence in many ways. For example, to interpret satellite data to identify households that are more vulnerable to storms and to floods. We use AI in the transport sector to detect where roads are in need of repairs and what are the critical points where we need to intervene to make travel safer and save lives. And these are just two examples of what we are doing currently at the IDB, and this is just the beginning. Digitalization and artificial intelligence are changing how we educate, they are changing how we govern in our countries, and how we deliver services. Indeed, they are changing how we create stories, how we code, how we cure disease, and so much more. For Latin America and the Caribbean, these technologies may represent a unique opportunity to accelerate development, make ourselves more productive and more inclusive. But these benefits are, of course, not automatic. They require investment in infrastructure, which in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, it must be quite large, robust governance, and above all, people with the skills to use and take advantage of artificial intelligence and digitalization. That's why the IDB Group has developed an AI framework and a broader digital strategy built on three pillars: institutions and governance to ensure ethical, responsible, and transparent use of technology, data and infrastructure to create the backbone for innovation and creativity and connectivity, and people to build the skills and human capital needed for a digital and AI-driven economy. Through initiatives like FAIR-LAC, which has been there for a while, and our work on digital transformation, we are helping countries adopt these technologies responsibly and inclusively. There are important questions about water and electricity use by data centers in a region where so many don't have proper access to either. And the trade-offs are, of course, difficult. Regulations that seek to make AI and other technologies safer could slow down the needed investments and innovations for the region. And this brings us to the reason of why we are gathered here today: research. Research can help us navigate these uncertainties. At the IDB, we believe that the research must be a guiding principle of our decisions and of our operations. Why? Because evidence is what allows us to move from good intentions to real impact. We need to understand what works, where are the gaps, and how we can design policies and projects that maximize benefits and minimize risks. This is why this conference matters. It's not just about discussing technology, it's about generating the knowledge that will shape our strategy and help us allocate resources where they can make the biggest difference. Over the next 2 days, you'll hear from leading experts on digital technology, labor markets, governance, and more. I encourage you to engage actively, challenge assumptions, and help us build a research agenda that will make digitalization and AI a force for inclusive and sustainable development in our region. And just a quick heads up, we are working on a major research project on digitalization and AI as part of our Development in the Americas series. It will be ready next year. And the teams are already coming with very interesting and exciting insights. Together, let's turn innovation into impact, because digital transformation is not just about technology. It's about creating better lives for the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, guided by evidence every step of the way. So thank you, and let's get started.
Thank you very much for joining us for our first keynote, not Clino. I think Pete Clino doesn't really need a very long introduction because his work precedes him. He got his Bachelor of Science in Berkeley, then he got his PhD at Stanford. He went there and had an amazing career at Chicago Booth, and then he went back to his alma mater at Stanford. He has seminal work in growth, schooling, prices, misallocation, but going over his vita, which I made the mistake of printing, and it's a little bit long, I found out that one of his first papers was learning by doing spillovers in the semiconductor industry. And I think a sign of how great you are is if you can go back to your first published paper and realize that it's as important then as it is now. It mentions, it has findings in terms of whether a firm learns more from itself than from other firms. It has findings as whether we learn equally within a country as opposed to across countries. It also has findings differentiating different type of firms. If you want to know, the Japanese were the same as everyone else. And again, as I said, I think this is a sign of great work. What you did a long time ago, and then not put a lot of age to that, is relevant. And so today we will have you to talk to us about ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And this is joint work with Timo Bopart, Huey Lee at the San Francisco Fed, and Reiko Lasky, a graduate student at Stanford. And our motivation for this paper, and I'll try to tie it to obviously very topical issues about the impact of AI potentially on growth as I go. The idea, or the motivation of this was not so much AI per se, but you'll see that it does connect, which is to say, there's a lot of reliance on patent and R&D data, which is fantastic, and a lot of really cool research, looking at, for example, which occupations are exposed to AI, looking at patent data. But one limitation of patent data is that it's really concentrated in manufacturing and software, and maybe some health. So if you think about like the retail revolution, Amazon, is that going to be picked up by patent data or even R&D data? So it'd be nice to complement patent and R&D data with some other data sources that might shed some light. So one piece of information that we're going to try to take advantage of is looking at publicly listed firms and their price-earnings ratio. So just think of market cap relative to their total earnings. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in this. So in this picture, you've got Tesla on the far right and Ford on the far left. To us, it's suggestive that maybe people expect like if firms were constantly profitable and big, but not growing, then they should have high price and high earnings, but not necessarily high ratio. So on the right, that's like they're saying Tesla has a bright future. Their future earnings are going to be even bigger than today, and that's why they're worth more as a fraction relative to today's earnings. And so the idea is this might have real-time information about expected growth contributions being much higher for Tesla than, say, Ford. And then you have other firms in here like Walmart, but a lot of in Intel, kind of an old tech firm, but also some of the Magnificent Seven, these high-valued companies. So looking at this, our question is, can this be used to forecast growth contributions? Again, in real time, we could maybe look at AI-related stocks and say, they have really high PE ratios, and try to convert that somehow into an expected growth contribution. So I'll talk more about that as I go. So what we do in this paper is basically try to use price earnings ratios and other information, the sales, for example, of the firm, to try to glean information about expected growth contributions. And in the earnings you can picture, we're calling those rents because the idea is that earnings might be expected to grow in the future because you're going to be innovating in ways that are going to generate a bunch of rents later. So Tesla might be worth a lot today because they're expected to produce a stream of innovations that will be very profitable in the future. So we build a model with that flavor in which firms, if they're permanently innovative and productive, they aren't necessarily going to have a high price earnings ratio, as I described. So we're going to have firms go through this, variation over time in how innovative they are. If Tesla was innovative forever, they might take over the whole economy. So the fact that they're not expected to do that they have finite value, is kind of implicitly recognition that they're expected to grow rapidly for a while, but then level off. So it's not a forever phenomenon. But we're going to use the dynamics of price earnings ratios and earnings growth to figure out how persistent that expected elevated growth is. And the advantage of this approach is we can use publicly listed data for all sectors, not just the ones that heavily report patents. And in principle, we could even do this for privately held. We're going to apply it today to publicly listed companies. But in principle, if you had a valuation of a privately held firm, you could use that relative to their earnings. The same methods we used here could be used on those. So my kids, for example, are big fans of Shark Tank, I guess is that what it's called. And they've internalized that, if they're going to give somebody $100,000 for a 10% stake in the company's worth $1 million. So at privately held companies, as soon as somebody buys a stake, for 10% for $1 billion, that's like an implicit valuation of $10 billion. So you could apply this to any companies, including some of these most innovative ones that are still privately held, as long as you have a valuation in their current earnings. Okay, so there's a lot of literature related to this, but let me start with like the straw person at the top, which is kind of Jabra's law. So as somebody who works in the firm dynamics and growth literature, Jabra's law has this special role where we think it's approximately true, meaning that once you get at least above a certain size, a firm's sales don't really forecast its future sales growth. And so people have constructed models where forecast or growth is basically unforecastably different, or at least invariant to size, where it's just IID firm growth. So a bigger firm would contribute more, but basically if you're twice the size, you're expected to contribute twice as much. So Erzo Lutmer, over 10 years ago, made a great contribution and a flash of insight that I think is wonderful, which is he said, okay, let me simulate an IID growth model. And of course, that produces Jabra's law in a Pareto firm size distribution, and then says, okay, I can use this to fit the data on publicly listed firms. And then he looks in the model and says, how old are the firms, say, above 10,000 employees or more? And in the model, they're 700 years old on average, if you had IID growth. And in the data, if you look at firms with 10,000 or more employees, they are 70 years old on average. You have a mix of these young firms like Amazon and young like Walmart, and these much older firms, like some of the big auto manufacturers. So he said, look, you can't get this. You can't get these young, big firms unless you have a deviation from IID growth. Some people start small and persistently grow at a rapid rate. So that says you don't have Jabra's law. There's some forecastability of growth. There's some persistence of differences in growth contributions. They're not IID. So he had that insight, and he had a big role for firms. Some firms are really good at proliferating their products. So picture an auto manufacturer adding more product line or more car models. So, and the related paper is by Berlinguer, De Ritter, and Lashkari and Rigo, which is very nice using French data. It says part of how you get this right tail is some firms have this burst of creating a bunch more products. They don't really emphasize persistence so much, but how we differ from both of those previous papers, which are quite nice, how we complement them, is we emphasize not just adding more products, but becoming more profitable per product. So that over time, the earnings relative to sales are expected to grow. And that's why the firm's worth more in the future relative to its current earnings. It's because it's actually thinking it's going to become more profitable. Think of Amazon that wasn't making money for years, but had a really high market cap. Where's that coming from? It must be that they're expected to go from being unprofitable to being profitable. So the market's forecasting that they're going to become more profitable, which to us is possibly a signal that they're going to make some big steps. They're going to make some big improvements that'll earn high profit rate in the future. And so the market's saying, hey, you have all this innovative capacity. You might be unprofitable now because you're investing now in becoming more profitable later. And all that investment's going to pay off in innovation and future growth. Okay, so today I'll talk about the empirical patterns first, and then a model, and then do some calculation, some quantification with the model. So the motivating empirical observations are all about publicly listed firms, and basically 3 objects. Well, maybe a fourth will be we use some R&D data, but that's only for manufacturing, because in publicly listed firms, R&D is basically 0 for a lot of firms outside the manufacturing sector. So we'll try to use that sparingly for maybe just like one empirical target and some motivation. But the core pieces of data we're going to use are things like the market cap and their earnings, but also the level of sales. Okay. All right, so we're going to use this sample. For some of the numbers I'll show you at the end, I couldn't resist trying to update some things through 2024. Even that feels a little, end of 2024 is a little outdated if you think of Oracle market cap more than doubling in the last couple months, or Intel plummeting and things like that. But this is the data I have for most of the analysis I'll show you. And I'll point out when I, at the end, deviate and show you some 2024 end of year numbers. So picture we're pooling all of these firm years of publicly available, publicly listed firms. And one thing I want to clarify as a macroeconomist is this isn't the whole economy. I know you know that. But I just want to clarify we're aware of that. So we'll have a model where we treat this like the universe, but it really isn't the universe. It's only about 1/4 of non-farm employment. And I thought, well, it's probably a much bigger fraction of value added. Turns out it's not. It's about 1/4 of value added too. So I'd love to apply this to privately held firms, get some data from PitchBook or something and extend this to a lot more innovative firms that are privately held. But for today, I'm going to be showing you numbers for 1/4 of the economy. So in the end, when I say Microsoft or NVIDIA is expected to contribute this much to growth, you really want to divide it by 4. Their share of growth contributed by CompuStat potentially, maybe not the whole economy. Although maybe not. Maybe CompuStat firms are going to contribute more than their share of value added, and that's why some of them are publicly listed. So, but that's for future research to some extent. Okay, so all right. So price earnings ratios. We're not going to be saying the price earnings ratio is only reflecting potential future earnings growth. We're aware, none of us are finance people, but we're aware that there's potential variations in risk premia that could also generate variations in price earnings ratios. So all we're really going to ask is to what extent does a firm having a high price earnings ratio actually predict subsequent earnings growth? So the fact that it's not a perfect predictor, that's fine. The fact that there might be over-optimism sometimes and pessimism sometimes, we're going to be looking on average, how successful is it? And therefore, using its average forecastability as an indication of how much a high price earnings ratio today indicates future earnings growth and potentially some innovative contributions. Okay, so lots of dispersion in the price earnings ratio. Picture it going interquartile range, going from something like 5 to 50. So that's a lot of variation, right? And again, a model with, I haven't shown you a model, but so trust me on this, a standard model with IID growth and no variation in the risk premium, this would be just a single point. So we're saying, there's a lot of dispersion, but again, it could be all coming from risk premium dispersion, so maybe it's not forecasting earnings growth at all. So we run a regression like that. Let's run actual earnings growth, horizon 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 years on today's price earnings ratio, and the data likes that. The data says there's some forecast power in that. And then if you ask, is it growth in earnings and sales, then it should show up in the sales growth and not earnings relative to sales. So those great papers I mentioned, the Lutmer and the Berlinguieri et al., they would have it all load on sales growth, because a firm with a high price-earnings ratio today would be adding a lot of products of similar profitability. So nothing happens to the price relative to their earnings. Their just price and earnings will grow together, or their sales and earnings will grow together, I should say. But in the data, a high PE ratio signals high growth in earnings relative to sales. That 70% or more of the forecast power of earnings is for faster growth in earnings than sales. So it's like Tesla is expected to become not only grow in sales, but have its earnings grow faster than its sales, that its profit rate will grow. And we're keying off that because we think it tells us they're not just adding products to their portfolio that are equally profitable with today's portfolio, but maybe ones that have bigger profit rates. If you think about NVIDIA having a profit rate of 70, 80%, or old Intel having a profit rate of 70, 80%, that's like saying they're killing it. These products are so good relative to the next best competitor product that they can charge an enormous markup. So we're going to tie that big markup to they must be doing something really impressive, introducing products that are not only different from what's been there before, but really good compared to the next best product out there. That's the general idea of what we're doing. Okay, so you could look at this, though, and say, okay, fine. A high price-earnings ratio predicts future earnings growth. How do you know that has anything to do with innovation? So for this picture, we're going to say, let's look just at manufacturing and ask whether PE ratios are connected to R&D intensity. Again, we only have the R&D data for manufacturing, so this is a manufacturing-specific figure. And the data tells us there's a very strong relationship. As you take the price-earnings ratios from 5 up to 50, the R&D intensity goes from 4 to 10. Right? So there's a strong connection in the data that high PE ratio firms are investing a lot in what looks like R&D, even within manufacturing. So this isn't manufacturing versus non-manufacturing. It might be a reporting issue. It's within manufacturing where they're basically all reporting some R&D type expenditures. So this at least gives us some connection of this price-earnings ratio and its forecastability of earnings growth, that it might be connected to innovativeness or effort in terms of innovation. Okay. You might also think about, wait a minute, you haven't talked about a life cycle. And the model right now, what I described, won't have a life cycle. It'll have firms kind of churning in terms of how innovative they are. So Apple's a good example for us, because Apple was very innovative. When I was growing up, we had the Mac, and that was great. And then later you have the iPhone and iPad and stuff like that. But they had a period in between where they were not a high PE ratio firm. So they've gone through waves of high innovativeness, low innovativeness, high innovativeness. That's the kind of model we're going to write down. But you do see this pattern in the data that if you're publicly listed and you're small in terms of sales, you have high R&D intensity. So it looks like some of these firms are not very big, but they're very R&D intensive, and they might be contributing a lot to growth. So we're going to want a model where you're not necessarily big in R&D intensive, but you're also small in R&D intensive. And this is also going to say, hey, this is going to hint that we're going to have an important deviation from Jabra's law. Because again, Jabra's law, the natural explanation for IID growth would be a flat version of this picture, and the data doesn't like that. Okay, so one aside I want to say is, we know the firms in CompuStat are not randomly selected. Not only are they above average size, but conditional on being small, they're probably ones that are expected to grow a lot. Like, how did you get publicly listed? How do firms like Amazon, when they were losing money, go public? It was because people said, oh yeah, they're losing money, but they're crushing this retail sector, and they're going to turn profitable later. So one of the reasons we really need to think more down the road about incorporating the non-CompuStat sector is that part of this deviation from Jabra's law may be selection. But again, in the IID unforecastable growth, there should be no selection. You can't forecast future growth contributions. So how could you select firms to be publicly listed with high growth contributions? You can't do it. There's no way to do it. So the fact that in the real world, some unprofitable firms and small firms go public and they're R&D intensive is consistent with a model where they've got great innovative capacity, and they're small, but they're expected to generate a stream of innovations that justify their market cap, why they're so highly valued despite low sales, low earnings, and maybe even low earnings relative to sales. Okay, this is earnings growth against earnings. So this would be like a Jabra's law picture for earnings. And you can see deviations. Again, within the CompuStat sample, one thing we need to do is go to the census data. And the census data, my guess is it's flat. So I think you could look at this and say this is an artifact of selection. But again, we say that selection's informative. In our base models and growth with firm growth, there should be no selection. So the fact that there is selection of high growth potential firms, that already is a deviation from Jabra's law. So this could reflect selection, but it's selection that's informative rather than being an artificial type thing. Okay, so we can do the same regressions of earnings growth and earnings relative to sales and so on versus earnings instead of versus the price earnings ratio. And you see this mean reversion when you run those regressions. Okay, this is just showing you, literally, if you think about Jabra's law in terms of sales growth on sales, in the CompuStat sample, you have an important deviation from it. And again, our interpretation is that when we go into the census and look at all the firms, like the LBD, where they have firm-level sales and not quite earnings, though, but they have sales, so you could look at sales growth against sales, we expect this to be flat. And so we think what's happening is the firms that go public are the ones that are expected to contribute a lot of growth, and that's why they're publicly listed. And so again, we think this reflects selection, but it's informative. Okay, all right, I'm ready to talk about the model now. So the model, we're going to build on this modern classic by Klett and Kortum. And I think, I think of models like, there's different types of modelers. There's I would say the kind of engineer modelers who think about models as, let's build a very realistic model. Like if you're building a bridge, you better have a really realistic model of how that bridge functions so that it's safe and functional. But there's also the view of like models as maps. And I kind of subscribe to that I'm not trying to put everything in the model. I'm trying to put some key features and learn from them. And I'm even willing to put numbers on them, even though I know the models are missing lots of things. So this is deliberately not a very complicated model. In fact, we're happy with that. We're able to characterize parts of it analytically within a few days, and the parts that we couldn't analytically do in a few days, we could do simulations in a few days. So then we could spend all the rest of our time, thinking about tweaks to the models and thinking about, estimating parameters to fit data and things like that. Okay, so we take this beautiful model by Klett and Kortum, which is a map model, in the sense that it has one type of innovation, which is a firm making a better version of a product than some other firm. So all growth is like quality driven. So no process innovation growth, no human capital, nothing like that. But some aspect of the world, like cars seem to be getting better, computers seem to be getting better over time. So it's clearly out there, but it's missing, there's no added varieties in the economy. We just have this vertical growth of them getting better and better, no horizontal growth. Do I think that's literally true? No. Do I think there's no process innovation? No. But it's a simple model and it's beautiful. So and firms aren't even improving their own product. Is that realistic? No. But again, it's just like, hey, let's take a model that's simple and tractable and characterize some of its properties. But the key thing is that these are multi-product firms. And so it's a theory where firm dynamics firms get bigger when they add products, steal them from other firms by producing better versions, and they contract when somebody else takes products away from them. Right? So think of Apple coming up with an iPhone, a smartphone that kind of reduces Nokia and BlackBerry's market share. So I think it captures something, and people have documented bigger firms do have more products. So I think it captures something that's very much in the real world, but obviously more simple in the real world in multiple ways. But a lot of people like to take it as a base model and build on it, and we're among them. Okay, so how are we going to enrich it? We're going to say firms differ in their step size. So the original Klett and Kortum, all firms have the same step size, or maybe in some later section, there's permanent differences. And permanent differences don't cut it for us, because they would have a firm with permanently high step size that could always make big improvements, would have high earnings relative to sales, but the price-earnings ratio wouldn't be high. Their market cap would be high, and their earnings would be high. So we need somebody who today is not as profitable as they expect to be in the future, so their market cap exceeds their earnings. They're unusually high relative to their earnings. So that's why we're going to have shocks to a firm's step size, but also to its kind of R&D costs. So we kind of think about it like maybe Pfizer in Kalamazoo, it's not a company town literally, but a big firm in that town, and there's a water tower with Pfizer on it. They're arguably really good at research, but maybe not as innovative, maybe not in terms of the big step sizes. So they had a joint venture with BioNTech, and that produced a bunch of innovations. In fact, Pfizer might be better at the process part than the innovation at all. But we're going to have firms differ in a stochastic way. They're going to be cycling through in terms of how easily they come up with products and how good they are. So the R&D efficiency is like how easy it is to come up with products, and the step size is how good are they relative to the next. So we're going to have those two types of heterogeneity to kind of fit the data. And so relative to Clethodim had that if there were twice as many products, it's twice as easy for you to come up with new products. We're not going to have that because, again, that would lead everybody having the same price-earnings ratio. So we want right now, you're really good relative to your past at coming up with big improvements, and therefore you're going to grow fast for a while. But not forever, because otherwise you take over the whole economy. And one of the rich things that they had was entry and exit, and we're leaving that out for now. Okay, so you know verbally are kind of key elements. Okay, so the household's boring here. It's a representative household, also, of course, not realistic. And then aggregate output is just a Cobb-Douglas combination of the quantity Y of a bunch of different products indexed by I and their quality Q. And so the quality is going to be where the growth comes from. So that index being fixed at 1, that's the no variety growth. The measure of products is fixed at 1. So all the growth is going to be this vertical quality. Okay, and so then there's intermediate firms that are producing all of this unit measure of varieties and then feeding them to a competitive final goods sector. And so the firms all have the same process efficiency, just for simplicity. So the firms are really going to differ in their which products they're at the top of the ladder of. So that's where the innovation part comes in. So they're going to be investing in R&D, and even though we have R&D in the model, we might not measure it in the data. So when I show you some empirical applications, I'm going to be keen on predicting a firm's growth contribution through this lens of this model without actually using R&D data. So we can talk about firms that aren't in manufacturing, like Amazon and Walmart. Okay, so but picture this convex function. This X is the arrival rate of new products, how many products you're innovating upon and taking over. Gamma is the step size, how big an improvement you're making. So if gamma was 2, it would mean you're coming out with something twice as good as the competitor. And then phi, again, is like your R&D cost. So picture phi affecting how easy it is for you to take over products, and gamma is how much better your products are. So we have both types of heterogeneity. You can probably guess that we didn't start with that. We needed that to fit aspects of the data. We needed both of these sources of heterogeneity. Okay, but you can think about firms that differ exogenously in this gamma and this phi, this innovative step size and this arrival rate ability to come up with new products, but they're endogenously going to choose this X, this arrival rate. And their R&D spending, new, is greater than 1. So their R&D spending is a convex function of how many arrivals they want. And so X could be high, we'll see, for a couple of reasons related to phi versus gamma. Okay, so how are pricing and markups? We're going to do the same thing Clethodim did, which is just Bertrand. So in my hypothetical, if you had a product that was twice as good as the next best firm, you're going to be able to charge a 50% markup, meaning 50% of your price is going to be twice your earnings. So your profits will be 50% of your sales, which might sound crazy, but think about all these tech firms that have really high profit rates, like I mentioned, NVIDIA and so on. Okay, so picture then a firm, though, is a collection of products, just like in Clethodim. But unlike Clethodim, it's got all this heterogeneity within the firm in its markups. Because what we're saying is, at this moment in time, the firm has a certain innovative capacity in terms of how easy it is, in terms of phi. High phi means it's costly for it to come up with varieties. High gamma means it comes up with really good varieties. So that's cycling around. So today, though, their innovation today takes a step size today. In the past, they might have been only a step size of 1.2. And today, they're a step size, they hit some vein where it's like, we got all these good ideas. We can generate all these innovations that are going to be twice as good of what's out there. And so the firm is going to be a collection of these N products, but each of them will have a different markup. And that's where the summation is over the different markups that they'll have for these different products. And then we'll call that do I have the ability to point? No. We'll call that the operating profit, and we'll call earnings, we'll have to net off the R&D. So you see earnings with that minus phi, that's netting off the R&D, which is going to begin to be endogenous. The phi and the gamma are exogenous, but the X is like the choice that the firm's making. And of course, the markup it's choosing will affect how much labor it hires. So the firm is making innovation decisions, and then it's making labor hiring decisions to produce. But the R&D decisions, for innovative, the dynamic one. Okay, so the dynamic firm problem just stating it as the present. So we're going to make it easier on ourselves. This is partly why we could do the analytical stuff in a few days, is we make kind of two key assumptions. One is the economy is in steady state. That's not totally helpful for thinking about AI, which may be accelerating the growth rate, but bear with me, this is what we're doing for now. So if you're in a steady state, this model has a really nice feature, which is all the products are kind of randomly creatively destroyed. Who creatively destroys them is a function of how innovative they are now, but the overall rate, like whether you're going to be a target, is independent. And that's really convenient because now you have an R&D decision today, and then you just sit on those rents and wait for them to be destroyed. So all your past decisions, that's just a portfolio you're sitting on, right? And those products are sitting ducks. And now you're trying to come up with new products, and that decision for your R&D today is basically memoryless, right? You might want to know how persistent your step size is and your R&D costs are, so that's forward-looking. They'll care about that, but that affects future R&D decisions. Today's decision is only a function of today's step size and today's R&D cost. Okay, and the other thing we did is by not making your number of products affect how efficient your R&D is, that state variable doesn't show up at all. So we've got basically kind of like our dynamic problem boils down to a static decision. And I guess, okay, so let me say a little bit more of this. This is the present discounted value of the profits from their whole portfolio. That's their value. And then the middle equation is just the transition equation for their number of products. And notice that the destruction rate X star, if we're in steady state, that's just a constant number. That's just the constant rate at which you're going to lose products. And those are your portfolio from past innovation that you're waiting for it to depreciate off. And then you've got a transition equation at the bottom for different types of step sizes, because we're keeping track of, was this a high step size innovation with a high markup and high profitability associated with, or low? Okay. All right, so with that tractability, we get this closed form where your R&D decision today, your arrival rate you choose today, is just a function of things like the aggregate growth rate and the aggregate discount rate that's constant because you're in the middle of a steady state, but is a function of your today's phi and today's gamma. So today's R&D cost parameter and today's step size parameter. That gives us a lot of tractability, right? Because we don't have to make this big dynamic decision in deciding today's R&D. So that was a strategic choice. And so what will make somebody choose high X today? Well, low phi, which is like low R&D costs. That makes sense. It shows up in the denominator there. And then high gamma. And high gamma, that's because it shows up in a high markup. The 1 minus 1 over gamma is the markup, so the higher your step size, the bigger your markup, and the more profitable that product is, and therefore you're more anxious to spend R&D to add high markup products to your portfolio than you would be to add low markup products to your portfolio. So the amazing thing about this is that you can get Jabrazla out of there. The reason Klett and Kortum made it easier for big firms with high numbers of products to add products is they wanted Jabrazla. And you might look at this and say, you're no way you're going to get Jabrazla out of this. So this is not a flexible model. You cooked into the model this deviation from Jabrazla, and it turns out no. With enough persistence in the phi and the gamma, we can get Jabrazla out of this, right? So we could estimate that and fit the data. You already saw the data, though. We're not going to be choosing to fit Jabrazla to fit the data. If the data looked like Jabrazla, we would generate Jabrazla out of the model. But we're not, because I just showed you the data we're trying to fit has sales growth inversely related to level of sales. So, but the model is flexible enough because of these shocks to generate Jabrazla in a very different way than Klett and Kortum generated it. Okay, so one thing that's kind of neat about this is that the price-earnings ratio has a common component, which is based on your past innovation, right? That's what I was saying. If somebody's just sitting on a portfolio, that's just certain profitability and certain value relative to their past innovation. So the first term is past innovation, and everybody's got the same price-earnings ratio component for that. All the difference is the forward-looking component. And that's what we're saying. We're saying, ooh, if all of the difference in the PE ratio is coming from future innovation, then we can use high PE ratio today as the market's expectation or predictor of how much that firm's going to be innovating in the future, adding more profitable products to our formula, contributing a lot of growth in the future. So that's what that second term in this company value is. So that would be like, yeah, let me leave it at that. Okay. So the growth rate in the balanced growth path is just a function of the the arrival rate for everybody and the step size, right? So you might look at this and say, oh, this is kind of mechanical. The growth is just a geometric average of all these step sizes. But the endogeneity is in that X, right? The x is a function of gamma and phi. So now we have decisions being made about where to allocate research effort and how much research effort. Not only just high x's would generate high growth, but the more x's are high where gamma is high, the more growth you'll get. Right? So the government might look at this and say, if we wanted to stimulate growth, we want to stimulate research in particular at high step size firms. Yeah.
Quick question. How can you separate gamma and phi? I saw them both on the X and the locations.
Right.
So how are you going to separate them?
So one critical moment there is going to be, I guess the microphone. So the question was, how can you separate out when you try to estimate from the phi and the gamma? So they're going to have different implications for the dynamics of earnings plus R&D. So the one reason why you might say, if you had low phi today, so high R&D efficiency today, you'll do a lot of R&D and you won't be very profitable, but you'll be adding products that are not particularly high step size if you don't have a high gamma. Okay, so if for the manufacturing subset we can add back R&D and ask to what extent does a high price earnings ratio predict growth in price relative to earnings plus R&D? If it's that sounds like phi. That sounds like R&D costs. If instead it predicts high growth in earnings relative to, or high price relative to earnings plus R&D, that can only come from the step size. So that's the key moment that we're going to use to distinguish those. Thanks for asking that. Okay. All right. So, and I'll circle back to this because we can ask how important is this heterogeneity in this model for the aggregate growth rate. We could shut down and say what happens to the growth rate, because again the base model cladocortum has no heterogeneity. So we can say how important is this heterogeneity and innovative capacity across firms for the aggregate growth rate. Okay. All right, so how does individual firm contribute to growth? Their history doesn't matter. Their history, that's gone. It's all about today's current step size and current R&D efficiency, plus the Markov matrix and how persistent they are. So if they have a high step size today and it's very persistently high, they're going to be expected to contribute a lot of growth in the future. So it's all about the current state. And again, as I alluded to, depending on the persistence of this stuff, you can get IID growth, or you can get serial correlated, or you can get growth unrelated to size, or you could get it perfectly correlated with size. Okay, so this is my inferior version of answering your question in one cryptic sentence there, but the richer version was how I responded to your question. Okay, so now I'm ready for quantification. Okay, so as I alluded to, we're just gonna, because the model is so tractable in the sense that we can solve for your decision problems now, analytically for your labor allocation and your R&D choice, what do we not know? Why do we have to do anything with simulation? Well, we don't know the stationary distribution across firms of, I mean, it's joint and it's complicated, how many products and what fraction of them are of each step size. We don't have that joint distribution analytically, so we just say, well, the computer's cheap. We just run that. We just simulate that until it settles down, and that's what took a couple more days. And then all the rest of the time is like, okay, now we got to choose parameters to estimate stuff, and then of course we had to figure out that we needed this variation in R&D cost to fit some things in the data. Okay, so the reason we can add so many states, 625 states, is this is just we have the decisions and it's just letting it roll, right? We just look at the realizations, calculate the decisions analytically, and then let it run. Okay. All right, so here's the things we're targeting, and it's a parsimonious model, so we don't nail all, and it's nonlinear, so you might say 9 parameters and 9 targets. Why aren't you fitting in exactly? I feel bad about that too. But it's a nonlinear model, and we haven't quite figured out. Maybe AI can help us find something in parameter space to fit even better. But here's what we have now. The growth target was about 1.3%. We were like taking TFP growth net of human capital growth, so we don't want to say all growth comes from technological change. And then the next one is a big discount rate. There's some tension because that big discount rate probably affects a risk premium, and here we have a model with no aggregate risk. So there's always these decisions when you're having a simple model and the world's complicated. The third one is what's the contribution of growth in earnings relative to sales to the price over earnings plus R&D. That's the moment. And notice we look at that, and then we separately look at growth in earnings relative to R&D of sales to the growth in earnings of sales. So those moments together are critical for separating the step size heterogeneity from the R&D cost heterogeneity and their dynamics. And then here's the critical thing I want to emphasize is rows 6 and 11 here. We're not trying to explain all the dispersion in the PE ratios. So, you know, if you're a finance person, which is awesome, you might be thinking, these people are thinking all dispersion in the PE ratio is reflecting earnings growth. No, we're just using the fitted dispersion, the 90-10 dispersion in the fitted predictable variation in earnings growth that's predicted by a high PE ratio today. So we're not trying to, the model will underestimate empirical dispersion in the PE ratio, and we're fine with that, because we're just trying to pull out the part that actually predicts future growth. And then we do use the time where you can see we use R&D for some of the moments, 1, 2, 3 of the 9 moments. And one of them is we want to get this negative slope of R&D intensity with respect to size. That's going to be critical because the growth contributions are going to be a function of R&D. So if your growth contribution is not going to be summarized by sales, it must be the R&D intensity varies, and we're going to use that moment. So you can anticipate from that, we're going to have a model that deviates from Jabr's law because the small firms are more innovative to fit the data, at least in our CompuStat sample. Okay, and the last moment, this is a critical reason we needed this. It turns out variation in the step size is only so powerful, because I didn't mention it to you, but we've got convex R&D cost, that new parameter. So suppose you had enormous, a step size of 20. You know, your markup will be 95% of your sales, but that actually doesn't do that much because your convex R&D costs, you can't just costlessly generate these really high markup products. That convexity is going to do a lot of limitation in terms of how big firms can get. So we needed a lot of this phi variation. So phi variation versus step size variation is partly the dynamics and partly just to get the dispersion in the size. There's only so much power in profit rate given the convexity of how easy it is to come up with products. Okay, and then, so you can see the 90-10 ratio is like 17, so we're not nailing it in the model, but we're getting a lot. We're getting a lot of size variation. Okay, so what parameters do that? The new up there is 3.5. If my colleague Nick Bloom was here, he might say that number's 2. Because he looked at R&D tax credits and said, it looks like the convexity of the R&D cost is about a square. And that's used a lot in the literature. But I want to point out, that's based on firms that report R&D, right? This is a broader measure where manufacturing's, 10% of this sample. So 90% of our data is not being estimated off manufacturing. They might be right that it's quadratic in manufacturing, but there's more curvature outside manufacturing. That could easily be, and we're providing an estimate of that. Okay, the rho gamma, that's the persistence of your step size, so 0.93. So that says if you're high innovative today, you're going to tend to be high innovative next year too. And then let's go down to the persistence of the phi, which is your R&D efficiency. That's 0.82, not quite as persistent. But now let's look at the heterogeneity in the variance. So see, the variance is enormous for the phi. So we need a lot of heterogeneity in how efficient you are in terms of your R&D to generate big size differences across firms. But we're also very interested, so we got less heterogeneity in the step size, but we're very interested in it because it's so important for your growth contribution. We'll see. I'll show you a calculation like that. Okay, but the second to last row shows the covariance between these we've estimated. And I'm not sure what we wanted a priori. I'm sure we would have rationalized whatever we found. So here's my rationalization of this very positive correlation between your step size and your R&D costs. If you can come up with really impressive improvements, it might be really expensive to do it. It might take a lot of research effort to do it. You can do it, and other firms can't, but it'll be really expensive for you to do it. It'll still be worth it because you'll get an enormous markup, but it'll be costly, right? That's what our estimate, that positive covariance, is telling us. Okay. All right, let me skip over this. The model generates Jabr's law, a deviation from Jabr's law. That's not surprising. Let me skip forward. Okay, so here's one of the punchlines is this is a plot of contribution to future growth in the calibrated model against deciles of sales. So these aren't deciles of firms. Each of these bins has the same share of sales. So that to be 10% of sales and you're the smallest bin of firms, there's a lot more than 10% of the firms there. And to be 10% of sales on the right, you have to be a lot fewer than 10% of firms because you're the biggest ones. But Jabr's law predicts that they all contribute 10% to growth. In the CompuStat sample, we're saying no. We're saying the bottom 10% of sales firms are expected to contribute 60% of the growth. And again, you might be like, really, 10% of the firms? But I didn't say 10% of the firms. I said firms responsible for 10% of the sales. If I do percent of firms, just sum that thing. To get up to 60, I got to do the bottom 7 deciles. So the bottom 70% of firms are contributing like 60% of growth. And you can see the biggest firms are contributing more to growth than the smallest firms, right? Because these are equal numbers of firms in this one. And the top 10% of firms are contributing more. They're just not contributing as much as their sales share. And that's why you see a deviation. Okay, so here's the part where I was most excited, that's right out of the oven for this conference. We really want to be able to talk about individual firms. And so we need, in the model, we have these 2 parameters. We can't just read those off the data, right? So, because if we're using dynamics and dispersion, that doesn't give us individual by firm. So we said, can we predict using observables, not including R&D, because we want to do this outside manufacturing too, from the price-earnings ratio, earnings relative to sales, and sales. Look at the last column, we can get 50% of the predicted growth contribution variation. So now I've got a predictor. It's not perfect, but let's use it in the data. So I'll skip over that. Okay, so this is what we've got. We said in Compustat, at the end of 2024, I couldn't resist moving forward to one more year, and say, let's just rank the firms by their growth contribution, which is the second to last column. And lo and behold, the Magnificent Seven is the top 7. The highest market cap firms are the highest contribution to growth. But they're not the same in terms of their growth contribution relative to their market cap. So I'll show you some contrast on that. But I guess we can look at it. Let me just try to give you, is it saying Microsoft is contributing 9% to the US growth rate? Remember, you might want to divide it by 4, but still, 2.25%, that's pretty big. Microsoft is only, divide the 1% sales share by 4, they're only about 0.28% of sales, and yet they're expected to contribute 10 times more to the growth rate. You see NVIDIA pop up in here. If I had more recent data on NVIDIA, it'd probably be forecast to contribute even more. NVIDIA is only 0.3%, divide that by 4, 0.08% of sales, and yet they're expected to contribute, divide the 3 by 4, 1 percentage point of all growth in the economy, according to our calculation. And we have some old firms like, Eli Lilly, and MasterCard, but it's just really interesting to look at who's expected to contribute growth. And so you can imagine taking this and separating out AI firms and saying, how much are AI firms expected to contribute to growth? It's a little bit tricky because we know Microsoft, Google, or Alphabet here, and Amazon do a lot of cloud services stuff. So you could say and then they have these AI products. We don't have ChatGPT in there; they're privately held. So if we get PitchBook, we could add companies like that. But they are expected to contribute in an outsized way. You could look at things like what's their market cap and their PE ratio increased a lot since AI has come along, and you could probably try to do some sort of a diff and diff to say how much of the burst in their expected growth contribution is related to their AI activity. So we haven't done that. That's not quite our exercise, but okay. One last thing related to this. It's nice to contrast like Amazon and Walmart, right? The sales share is about the same, about 3%. Again, for the whole economy, divide that by 4, but in the Compustat sample, about 3%, but look at the growth contribution. Amazon's supposed to contribute 4% of all growth in the Compustat sample, whereas Walmart, 0.2%. So same size and massive difference in their expected growth contribution. The other one's, what's that, 20 times higher, right? You can look at NVIDIA versus AMD. NVIDIA versus AMD, what's that? That's, if I do it in my head, factor of 36. Higher NVIDIA contribution than AMD, but even though they're only 2.5 times bigger, they're 36 times the growth contribution. So you see the flavor of what this could potentially be used for. NVIDIA is expected to contribute a ton more to growth, even relative to their current sales. And we're using their price-earnings ratio to say the market thinks they're going to be doing gangbusters in the future. And I've even heard auto executives complain. They'll say, Tesla's not even that big, right? Share of sales, they're smaller than we are. Why does everybody bid up their price? They're expected to contribute 4% of growth, or divide that by 4 if you want. And you can see less than 1 basis point of growth coming from the big auto firms. Okay, I know I've got the red thing here. Let me see what I want to say in my overtime. I don't want to take time away from our discussion. But what do I want to say in like 1 minute? I guess I want to say, yeah. So if I got rid of the heterogeneity in the step size and kept the aggregate R&D effort the same, the growth rate would go from 1.5% in the model to less than 10 basis points. So this heterogeneity really matters. So if you say, oh, we've added a tweak to Coletta and Cordum, no. We've added something that's incredibly important for the growth rate. And where's that coming from? If you have a high step size and you know it and it's predictable, you're going to pour a lot of R&D effort into that, and that's generating a lot of growth, right? You don't have random allocation of R&D. You have it focused on the best prospect firms. Okay, and I guess I'll stop there, and yeah, I'll open it up for us.
Thank you very much.
Actually, the other day I was watching the History Channel. Yes, I am that type. And it was about, that was the innovation Goldman Sachs did. Goldman Sachs started to do IPOs based on their idea of what was the future sales of a firm, as opposed to what used to be done, which was just collateral. See?
Yeah.
Some
great.
advantages of watching History Channel. Let me just open up to questions, but before I'm going to give you a homework. You had a list of firms in your first paper. Tell me if these firms match your model. These are a lot of semiconductor firms, and to be fair, this is data from the 70 to 94. So I was looking at your persistence.
Yeah.
With 0.93, it's still a long time ago. So
It's a long time ago, and Intel has faded a bit relative to this heyday. Yeah, Intel shows up here, AMD. I'm trying to think. There's ones that don't exist anymore, like Fairchild. Yeah, there's a bunch I don't even know. Well, there's some Korean firms.
No, it made me feel better, because there's some firms that I had no clue what they were, and I'm like, I'm hoping that they die, and it's not that I just don't know what they are.
Yeah, like Texas Instruments. I'm going to embarrass myself. Do they exist? I don't know. They have calculators? I don't know.
They still do calculators. Oh, wow.
But I think I'm going to say this is a win in the sense that the persistence is not supposed to be one, right?
No.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. 0.93 allows this to work.
Right. So I guess you could say, Coletta Cordum went so far as to say, creative destruction is not only there, but there's, the only reason there's not a lot of persistence, not a lot of cycling, is because if you have a lot of products in your portfolio, you're good at adding more. And we're saying, no, you kind of lose that ability. Not just randomly, but you systematically, if you're big, you probably were innovative in the past, and that's not going to persist. So we have a lot more churning than they do in their setup.
And even your Eli Lilly, the product is a very new product.
Right. The Me Too product to Ozempic.
The Ozempic version of Lilly, which I don't know what's the name.
Yeah, what is it called? I don't know. But yeah,
I don't know.
They have trials saying it's somewhat effective with oral rather than injectable. Yeah, and so they're forecasting all this growth. Oracle's another great example, because the doubling of the market cap, what happened, they got all these orders from OpenAI to build a bunch of infrastructure for them.
So let me open up for questions. There's a mic. Please use the mic.
Okay. I have a different model in my mind. Because it seems, if I understand correctly, that you seem to get like the P ratio to forecast. What if, especially with the new firms like Amazon or NVIDIA, you have like some locked-in effects? What the investors are buying is that you're going to be the one player in town. That's not going to relate to the increase in welfare that you're going to get in the end, but it's just that I own it all. How could that, if that's true, which I didn't calibrate my model in my head, how would that bias your results, and would it be a way to decompose like these two effects?
Okay, so I think that's a great point. And like thinking about network externalities that, we're Amazon Prime members, probably everybody in this room, that's like a lock-in effect, or at least a switching cost. And so, one irony is like, when economists talk about market power, we talk about it as the enemy of consumer welfare. But if you teach in a business school, which I used to, and some of my friends write textbook, it's like, here's how to price discriminate. Here's how to increase barriers to entry. Here's how to increase switching costs. So I think that would show up as persistence in FI, because they would be big, and they would be able to maintain market share. And it might not churn very much, right? Because you'd have a lot of persistence. So I'm trying to think of bias, I guess. I'd have to think about it. But there's probably a stochastic process for other people to be able to start undermining your network that would mimic our persistence or lack of perfect persistence. So that's something to think about. I think it would bias us toward saying more growth is more innovative when it could be more successfully building a network.
I have another question. It's related to the results that you've shown us, especially when you were trying to differentiate from the finance people. You are only considering the predictive power of the P ratio on the growth of earnings or earnings to sales in the future. An alternative explanation, or something that we've maybe potentially seen in the past, is that there are periods of time in which these P ratios explode, and it's actually there is like a bubble. Think of the dot-com bubble of the 2000s. So I was wondering how stable is that relationship that you are actually using, and if you could actually try to estimate it, taking periods in which we have expected that there is a bubble out of the sample, to see if the predictive power of those G ratios change over time as well.
I think we haven't done it, but that's a great suggestion. And the way you framed it, I think, is really nice, because to the extent that, like, we all lived through the dot-com era, people were forecasting these enormous growth contributions. I would expect if we restrict it to that sample in the IT sector, the forecastability wouldn't be great, right? So that would be kind of reassuring, because it would be saying the forecastability we're getting on average is a combination of some periods where it's better than others because of these bubble-like behavior. So we should do more of that. And then, of course, now in real time, it limits the applicability, because we don't know if we're in a irrational exuberance era or not.
Edward.
Okay. Thank you very much for that super interesting presentation. I want to ask you about a slide that you skipped, and I want to give you the opportunity, because I think it's really, what are, in your views, the policy implications of some of this work, and in particular, being here at the IDB, if you can, I mean, of course, your model uses data and firms from the US, but if you think that there are some broader implications for policy in emerging markets in developing countries, I think that would be super useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. So, I'll have to say as a caveat that policy implications for an R&D subsidy that we talked about on that slide, and of course, to the extent that there are sectors that don't report R&D, it's not as helpful for those. But for at least within R&D, you harken back to my undergrad days. I took a tax class because I have 9 older siblings, 3 of whom were tax accountants, or are tax accountants, and then my father was a tax accountant. So growing up, it was great, because he was constantly telling me about how companies would do stuff, clients would do stuff just because of the benefit at the margin of reducing their tax at the margin. So when I started taking econ, I'm like, they're belaboring the obvious. Okay, so where did that undergraduate tax class, it had an R&D section, and I remembered the R&D in there, the R&D tax credit in the US is actually incremental. So if you had a constant R&D to sales ratio, you get no subsidy at all, no R&D tax credit at all. It's the increment, how much higher is your R&D to sales ratio now relative to the distributed lag of it. So it turns out in our model, that might be pretty good. Because for one thing, you don't want to do a thing where you're saying, I mean, you always know people will have a bias in reporting R&D, but you want to somehow, let me say one thing before that, which is, what the planner really wants to subsidize is the high step size firms, because they're making contributions that other people will build on. So that is a high spillover. So the planner, in an earlier paper with some of the same co-authors, we emphasized that the planner could if it could see the step size, they would kind of reallocate, have a higher R&D subsidy for them. In a way that does that, because incremental high R&D intensity in our model is because you just got the green light. You just said you have a rich vein of high step size things, so giving them more subsidies is good. Making an incremental subsidy just happens to be, I think they did it just to save revenue. They didn't want to subsidize inframarginal R&D that was going to be done. They wanted to subsidize incremental R&D. So it was a good bang for the buck idea, but in terms of our model, it's even bigger bang for the buck because it's bigger step size. So we haven't quantified that in our model. That's on our to-do list. But that's where we think it relates to some policy. We need to think more about how to subsidize firms that are innovative that don't report any R&D. We need to give more thought to that, I think.
Yes, hi. There's this paper, I think it's by Xavier Jabba, that links the existence of Gebrad's law to the Zipf's, to a Zipf's law distribution across cities. So if Gebrad's law holds, then you'll see in the steady state distribution of city size a Zipf's law. The failure of Gebrad's law, therefore, would imply a rupture of Zipf's law in the steady state distribution of size. And I'm guessing there's something similar to be expected in, for from your model, if in this context Gebrad's law doesn't hold, that means something for the steady state distribution of firm size. Sure.
Okay, totally fair enough. So this is a conjecture because I haven't checked it, but since a lot of other people have checked Gebrad's law and they say it approximately holds when you have all firms, so now we have a puzzle, which is I'm telling you within CompuStat it doesn't hold. For the sample of all firms, it does hold. So I think it's similar to Lutmer's logic. There are some small firms that are very innovative and predictably are going to grow fast, but there must be, for Gebrad's law to hold unconditionally, there must be a bunch of small firms who aren't going to win anything, right? So there's a lot of heterogeneity, almost like the cross-country growth regression where you have growth rate on size. The big countries all grow similar rates. The small ones have very dispersed, but levels don't really predict growth. So I think something similar might be going on with Gebrad's law, that there's some small firms predictably fast growth, and there must be other ones with predictably slow growth to offset it. Because we do get approximately Gebrad's law in the Pareto in the whole sample, the whole distribution of firms.
So you mentioned that an advantage of using the PE ratio is that as long as the firm has a valuation, you can use it. It's particularly great for small firms or startups. But also, as you said, when they're very young and they have high growth prospects like Amazon, they have losses. So their PE is going to be negative. So how do you think about PEs in this context with that issue? In the model, I think it's just a huge G.
Infinite, yeah.
Infinite. But I was thinking, like, empirically, it must be an issue, right? Because it's growing and then it becomes negative. How do you deal with that?
So two things related to that. If you add up all the negative sale firms, negative earnings firms, and say how big is that relative to total earnings, it's about 10%. So losses out there are big in the CompuStat sample, and our model actually generates that. So we need to use it more, though, because you might want to ask at the very end, I contrasted to AMD. AMD is relatively profitable compared to Intel. Why didn't I use Intel? Intel has negative earnings. So I couldn't use them. So right now, one thing I skipped over in the interest of time is that in our model, the positive earnings firms are only contributing about half of growth. The negative earnings firms are really important for growth. So we couldn't use it literally because they don't have a PE ratio. So all the regressions of the PE ratio, we didn't use it. So I think we need to think more carefully about, like, earnings growth is in earnings difference divided by, sales or something. We need to enrich it so that we can calculate expected growth contributions for all these firms like Amazon in their early time that had negative profits but were expected to contribute a lot to growth. So we have work to do on that. First order question, yeah.
Yes. Interesting paper, but could we get into a little bit of what drives the persistence of the two parameters? And do you think that the fact that in certain industries, especially the AI and software-intensive industries, the nature of mergers and acquisitions, it's not just the products which are being replicated, but it's whole, people are buying into parts of the companies, and especially with AI, the whole notion of capital, intensive thing becomes expertise intensive. So the game is maybe changing, and actually the parameter stability may be very different in the future.
That's totally fair. So Rebecca Dix, we just hired from MIT, has a paper where she's saying capital investment, IT equipment investment is much more flexible now. You just rent from the cloud, right? So that relationship becomes much different. The whole irreversible building up a capital stock, that is very different now going forward because of the cloud than it was in the past. And Laura and I were talking at lunch briefly. I would characterize myself as a conditional optimist, about AI's contribution because it might make research more effective. I'm not using as much as Chad Jones, my colleague, but he talks about all the time about all the things it's able to do. It's changing so rapidly, I would have to heavily invest because he's like 1 week, this is the one to use, and then next week, okay, now I'll use this other one. And he's learning rapidly. So I'm optimistic that it can be used to make research more effective, and therefore, like in Chad's view of the world, you need to throw talent at it. And so maybe AI combining with talent will be leveraging our talent more effectively, and so we'll get faster growth out of it. So yeah, in that sense, there's only so much I can do from the past and extrapolate to the future. But hopefully the extrapolation will be conservative.
So let me go back to the policy question. So there are firms that do R&D and report it. There are firms that do an R&D and do not report it because they're not listed. But there's a lot of, I thought the original motivation is that there's a lot of firms that do innovation that is not the R&D type. So Walmart, why or how come Walmart became what it was? Because it had the idea that if you put distribution centers in the middle of nowhere, a huge scale, people would drive to them. And so that is not, and that idea turned them into a superpower retailer. So if you were a policy, so first of all, how would one measure that? And then what would be the policy implication? Give money to wild ideas or?
I mean, I guess in principle, we've got these observables, the price earnings ratio, the earnings over sales, and the sales. There's some weighted average of those. We deliberately didn't use R&D because we wanted to be able to talk about firms outside manufacturing. So in principle, you could use these to subsidize and to target firms, right? But then you'd have to have a PE ratio, so you'd have to be publicly listed or a pitch book. And you know, everybody in this room is aware of incentive problems. So that exists for R&D. You know, if you give somebody incentive to report R&D, they're going to report a lot of R&D and might fudge that. So major caveat of, you know, firms might play around to try to maximize their subsidy in ways that just fudge some of the accounting. So, but in principle, you know, certainly if the policymaker just could see how innovative they were, could just subsidize them directly. But we're trying to use observables. But I'm just trying to say the caveat is anything that's observable, the firm can manipulate its reporting of. Again, which is true of R&D as well. So there's things you can do and according to our model, but they have limits just like R&D subsidies do.
So if there are no more questions, let's break for coffee. Thank you very much. This was great.
Welcome back. We're going to start our first session of today, Digital Technology, Payment Systems, Global Finance, and Trade. Our moderator for this session is Fernando Arce from the Research Department. Fernando?
Thank you very much. My microphone's working. We're very happy to have Vincenzo Quadrini from the University of Southern California, Maggie Chen from the University of Washington, and from George Washington University, and Divya Kirti from the IMF. Each speaker will have 27 minutes. We will ask the participants to ask only clarifying questions during the presentation and save your final questions to the end of each presentation. And please ask them at the relevant microphones. Don't be like me during Pete's presentation. Thank you very much. Vincenzo, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation to give this presentation. This is a work joined with Marina Asimonti. For those who might know me, might be surprised that I write a paper on stable coins or in general digital economy. But actually there is a very direct link with my previous research interest in that. And in my previous research, I has been very interested in the issue of on a shortage of assets, perhaps initiated by Caballero and a co-author, and which has driven a lot of my research, including with Marina. Now, what is the connection with stablecoin in general? Cryptocurrency essentially is the creation of assets, financial assets. So we are sort of interested in understanding what are the implications of this creation of assets, new creation of assets. Okay. Now, I will spend the initial part of my talk clarify what I mean for the digital economy. Okay, because those days is very generic, but I will be very precise what I mean, and then presenting the content of the digital economy, I will also introduce what is the research question. Okay, and how we are going to approach that research question. Okay, so the first thing is what do we mean for digital economy? Because it could mean many things. Okay, so what we mean a marketplace where objects are traded in digital form. Okay, but of course this includes many things. Okay, so the second thing is that the market is decentralized. Okay, decentralized means that in principle, at least, there is not a major player, being the government or a private sector. Okay, so it's not dominated by big companies or public institutions. Okay, and the third one is that that decentralization is made possible by blockchain technology. Okay, so the blockchain technology is what makes possible to have a market that is decentralized, where operator can trade, exchange objects that might not be digital, but are exchanged in the digital form. Okay, so that is what we have in mind. Now, before going forward, what is the sort of a message that we would like to convey? The first is that the digital economy, in the way I define, is much more than cryptocurrency. Okay, cryptocurrency obviously have become a very well recognizable term. Okay, at this point we all know what it is, but I want to make the point that the digital economy is much more than that. Okay, second, the digital economy is small at the moment, okay, when we compare to the rest of the economy. But the potential growth is quite significant. Okay? And third, it could have a very important implication for the financial system. And that is the angle that especially we are interested. We would like to understand a little bit what could be the implication of the financial system. Of course, we are not able to investigate all possible implications, so we will emphasize some of the implication, but that implication also depends on the ability to perform other functions. Okay. So what are the functions that this digital economy does? So the way we think about the digital economy is that is a production economy. This might seem a little bit strange to some people, but effectively the digital economy produces services that are sold, traded, okay? And it generates assets and liabilities. Okay? So there are two types of production. There is the production of services, could be like maybe if I need to have a rental of a short-term rental, instead of using the traditional channel of real estate, I'm going to rent that room, that apartment through the decentralized economy, so with decentralized applications, for instance. Okay? And it generates assets and liabilities. And that is the part that we are especially interested in, the creation of assets and liabilities. Okay? Then, when you think about creation new assets and liability, then it becomes sort of natural to ask, could these new assets, okay, be viable substitute for traditional asset, traditional financial asset? For a store of value, that is what I would like to emphasize, okay? Something that we hold because perhaps they keep value for the future, okay? Okay? And what are these traditional assets? Well, or popular assets? Well, one could be the dollar, okay? So this is one possible question that we might be interested, okay? But, okay. Then it becomes natural to ask about what gives value to those new assets, really. Are purely bubbles, okay? So useless assets that have a value simply because people are willing to trade on the expectation that they maintain the value, okay? Or there is a more intrinsic or fundamental value. And we think that actually there is an intrinsic value of those new assets. Okay? Why? Here's why. Before I emphasize the production of the digital economy, because the digital economy is a production economy, and digital assets are needed to produce digital services. Okay? Okay. So here's an example that where I want to show that some of those assets can generate actually a return that is a stream of income. Okay? So what I show in this graph, this is the quantity of ETH, the native coin of Ethereum, okay, that is staked. Okay? So what does it mean being staked? Essentially is necessary for validator in the blockchain to validate the transaction. Okay? And for validating those transactions, they get paid. Those are the fees that they collect by validated transaction. Okay? That process of validation is, you can think a little bit like banks that are validating transactions between that we do with others. Okay? And here is a graph that shows what is the fees that are generated by staking the ETH and validated those transactions. Okay? The way this is reported is the value of fee over the value of ETH staked. Okay? So you can see that, of course, there is a lot of fluctuations, but in this period, which is not very long, but those are I believe that our monthly data is about 5%. Okay, so think it this way. Okay, so if you hold ETH crypto, essentially during this period at least, you generate an income of 5%. Okay, or a return of 5%. And you generate the 5% not because the value of it went up, are not capital gains, those, okay? Is the flow of income that you actually earned, okay? Okay, so, of course, I said, now there are those new assets, financial assets, that could be potential substitute for traditional assets, okay? For a store of value. But we know that for a store of value, an asset must be safe. Otherwise, it cannot be a very suitable store of value. So, of course, the natural question is, are cryptocurrencies stable? And we know that that is not the case. We know that they are very volatile. But here is where the stablecoins will play an important role. Okay? Stablecoins essentially are cryptocurrencies, but there are mechanisms that in principle should maintain their value. They are essentially cryptocurrencies that are pegged to something that is that maintains a stable value. So an example, of course, is the dollar. Okay, so a little bit the analogy is like the fixed exchange rate. When a country decides to fix the exchange rate, essentially it pegs the currency of the country to the dollar, for instance. A stablecoin is something similar. Okay? Of course, the difference is that when a country does that, there will be the monetary authority that implements a mechanism to make sure that the currency stay stable, right? Here there is not such a thing. There is not a monetary authority. In fact, I said this will be will function in a decentralized world. Okay, but there are mechanisms that in principle should guarantee that. Okay. And in fact, when you look at the most famous or more diffuse stablecoins, which are Tether, USD, and DAI, okay, you see that their price has been quite stable. So this is essentially is the exchange rate of a stablecoin with the dollar. Okay, you see that at least they maintain that. Of course, you know that there have been cases of collapse. You know, right? And but the way I see the collapse of stablecoins is because this is a new industry. And we know that in a new industry, there is a lot of turbulence. In any industry, there are a lot of entry. A lot of those entry fails, but few will try, and eventually the industry consolidate. So that is the way I also see the market of stablecoins, right? But how are they created? What is this mechanism? I'm sorry if I make it long, but actually all this introduction is instrumental to what I'm going to say next. Okay? So how are stablecoins created and maintained stable? There are many times. This is an industry that is very creative. There is a lot of financial engineering. Okay? But I'm going to emphasize two that I think that are the most important. One is very simple. Is backing one-to-one, one stablecoin with dollar. So the idea is very simple. You basically deposit $1 in an account in a way that you cannot touch. Okay? And you issue a liability, which is a stablecoin. Then once you issue that liability, you can use it to make payments, whatever you want to do. Once you do, somebody gets the stablecoins. If that person wants the dollar back, no problem, going back. There is that dollar deposit, you take that dollar, and the stablecoin essentially get eliminated, get burned. Okay? As long as there are always those reserves, there shouldn't be problem. This is similar. Now, the analogy with the fixed exchange rate is the currency board. Okay? Okay, that is the first. But there is also another way, which I think is interesting. Is that you always need reserves, okay? But those reserves don't need to be dollar assets. Could be something else. In fact, you can collateralize with crypto. Okay? Now, of course, crypto is very volatile. So you cannot, the reserves, of course, has to be more than the issuance of stablecoins. So if you make a deposit of $1 in, I don't know, Bitcoins, you can issue maybe only 30 cents of stable coins, because if then the price of Bitcoin changes, still is guaranteed. That is the idea. So if you, in some sense, you consider those two ways of creating stable coins, if we consolidate those two ways, you can think that on the liability side, there are stable coins, and on the asset side, there is dollar assets and the cryptocurrency. Okay? Now, if we think at how big those variables are, so this is a sort of a broad estimation. So dollar assets that are or should be available to guarantee the stable coins is about 203 billion. What have cryptocurrency, this is just an estimate of all the value of cryptocurrency. Okay? And what is the value of stablecoins? About 252 billion. So those were numbers that were for the beginning of 2024. They were. Okay? So ultimately, here we are going to build a sort of a model to understand how this could affect, in general, implication for the economy, where we start over from a quantitative point of view. We want to have an economy that captures that. With capture. Okay? Okay, but here is really the question that we are interested in. How does the potential expansion of the digital economy and the creation of stable digital assets affect the global value of the dollar? Dollar, as you know, is the international currency, is the most used currency globally. But the fact that now there are these stable coins, is it going to help the value of the dollar, or contrary, will has a negative effect? And here, when I'm thinking about helping the dollar or not, I mean how much the US government has to pay for its debt. Okay, so really I'm thinking about the interest rate. Okay, so if it's going to help the dollar, means that ultimately the US government has to pay lower interest. But if it's going to damage, then the US government has to pay higher interest. And it's not so obvious. Okay? Why? Because there are two contractive forces, and if stable coins are created mostly backed by dollar assets, it should help the dollar. Why? Because in order to issue stablecoin, you need to buy dollars. Of course, many would say, what's the point of taking $1 and creating one stablecoin that is also a dollar? Okay? And the answer is that in some sense, the stablecoin is like the synthetic dollar, which is in digital form. Okay? Is that there are things that you can do with a stable coin that is worth $1 that you cannot do with the traditional dollar. So, for instance, if you want to do transaction in the decentralized economy, you cannot use your bank account to make payments.
But isn't the stable coin more valuable because it can do more?
The Bitcoin? Yes, sure, but the value here is pegged to $1. Okay, so if what we could do, however, is because now with stable coins, in principle you can do more, so there will be more demand. But more demand of stable coins means more demand of the dollar. So that is. But if the stable coins are not backed by dollar, then it becomes a substitute. Okay? So in some sense, we are trying to understand what are the forces that are more important and especially we think about the potential for the future. Okay? And we have a model where we construct to try to understand that. I'm not going to show the details of the model because it will take too much time. I don't have much time. But I'll give you a little bit an overview, graphical overview. But what we find is this. Actually, we find that based on our assumption, of course, and projection, we think that in the long run, actually, the dollar will be favorable. So actually, it will help. Okay? Provided, of course, that the reserve asset is the dollar. They are pegged to the dollar. Okay? And another point I would like to make is that stablecoins don't have to be pegged to the dollar. It could be pegged to another currency, okay, around the world. Okay? So in that case, of course, if there will be issuance of more and more stable coins pegged to other currency, and those stable coins become attractive around the world, then perhaps it's equivalent to a switch of demand from dollars to. And in some sense, I think that this is a very important consideration if you consider what those days is happening, right? So you are very aware of the US that recently passed a very a significant law for regulating essentially the issuance of a stable coin. And one way to think about that is that probably is to make the dollar a little bit more relevant in the world economy. Okay? If we, the US, can issue more stable coins, indirectly, we are making the holding of dollars more attractive around the world. But recently, also Hong Kong passed a legislation to allow the issuance of stablecoin pegged to the Hong Kong dollar. Of course, right now, you know that the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollars. Okay. But the way I interpret that is a pilot program, eventually, for the Chinese currency to become the peggy currency. So you see that here in all of this, in my view, is related to which currency would be the world currency in the future. Okay? And probably that is why, not necessarily why, but it's one reason why there is a lot of interest in that. Okay, so this is what we find. I want to very quickly sketch the model. I'm not showing any equations, okay? But I want to show you a little bit the sketch. So think about the world where there is the United States. Why the United States? We are talking about the dollar, so is the issuer of dollars, essentially government bonds. Okay? And then there is the rest of the world. This, in today situation, we know that on net, the rest of the world holds dollars, government bonds, essentially, right? This is all the literature on global imbalance. Okay, this is before the digital economy. How do we think about the digital economy? Okay, it's a little bit difficult to locate the digital economy in this framework. Why? Because what is the location of the digital economy? Where does really operates? Okay, it's difficult to allocate to one country or to a set of countries. So conceptually, I think it will be useful to think as if the digital economy is a third country. It's something that it operates with their own money. There is not technically a strong supervision of what they do, although the countries are trying to impose their supervision and regulation of that. Okay. So the way to think is that it's a third country that is not defined by geographical border, but on the type of business, basically, that it does, okay? So now, there is this third world. What does this third economy does? It basically issues stablecoin. It issues these liabilities that, at the same time, they guarantee to be fixed. So now there is, especially the rest of the world, they see, oh, now I can get the traditional dollars, or I can hold a stablecoin. Ultimately, if I believe in the stability, they are equivalent. Okay, so maybe what is going to happen, they are going to buy those stablecoins and reduce the demand of traditional dollars. But remember, to create the stablecoins, we need, whoever creates, they need the reserves, right? So now, the United States might sell fewer treasuries to the rest of the world, but now they will be selling to this digital economy, right? So that is the kind of economy we are thinking about. Okay? Okay. So in 2 minutes, I want to show some very simple simulation. Then I will be done. But what is the idea? Okay. First of all, I said that this digital economy is like a new country that produces services, so in some sense it's selling services to the traditional country, okay? But issues also liability and asset. So what drives the growth of the digital economy? Of course, you need more and more people who get used and willing to do business with the digital economy. So more and more people who are willing to expand their portfolio and holds assets that are also digital. Okay? Also, you need more and more people who are willing to, if they need to borrow, instead of going to the traditional bank, they can do in a decentralized world. Okay? That is something that we take as exogenous. So the growth in the economy will be what we call the fraction of people who are become accustomed. Okay? And in some sense, it is a little bit like the contagion in epidemics. Okay? As more and more people around us are knowledgeable about that, so we learn about that, and more people start to. Okay? So we do some simulation like that. So this is the fraction of people who are accustomed in our simulation. Basically, it takes a lot of time, but it goes to a maximum of 10%. So I'm not claiming that everybody will be just an extra minute, if you don't mind, that will become all doing a lot of business with the digital economy. Okay? And as that the expansion of agents willing to do business with the digital economy expands, also the production of digital services will increase, okay? So we go from almost zero now to perhaps 1%, okay? 1%. And here is an interesting graph that I can connect to the talk that Clino made, okay? So this is the value of crypto. Crypto here is used as reserves to create stablecoins, okay? So you see that this is the crypto price over the income that is generated by the digital economy. The ratio is extremely high. Why is that? It's because implicit in our model is that the digital economy is going to grow. Because it's growing, it generates more income. And of course, forward-looking agents, they are going to internalize and will go to the price. But eventually, that price will decline over time. Okay. So lastly, what happens to the interest rate? So the blue, just look at the blue line. That in our simulation, what happens to the U.S. interest rate? There is a non-monotonic path, but you can see that in the long run, the interest rate is lower than the initial. Okay? Why? Because in this economy, they can use both dollars and other assets to create stablecoins, but the dollar remains still dominant. Becomes. Okay, since I am over time, I'm not going through the conclusion. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. We have time for one or two questions.
Hi, Vincenzo. Hi, João Aires from the research department. I have a question about what you mentioned about the choice between the pegged currency, the US dollar and Chinese, for example, currency. This isn't a choice, or has always been a choice of what to peg your currency to, like why we're choosing to peg to the US dollar. So is there any dimension in which the digital payment or the digital technology will change that? Because I didn't see much of an argument there, because this choice was already available in the past to peg to other currencies.
No, the way I see is that essentially by creating a digital form of the national currency, probably it makes easier for agents around the world, individuals around the world to use it. And consequently it could become more attractive. In addition to the fact that, as I said, if you want to do transaction in the digital economy, okay, you need to make payments with crypto, not with traditional currency. Why stablecoin? Because maybe while you operate in the digital economy, you don't want to face a risk, so it's better to hold the stablecoins rather than bitcoins and ETH. That is the same as the choice in the traditional economy of all the bonds versus shares. So I think that the technology makes easier the adoption, and in principle, even though that is not the case yet, in principle, should be cheaper. Okay? Because how do you hold essentially foreign currency? Bank deposits. You have to go through the bank. And there are a lot of fee, perhaps some market power of the bank, that at the end the return that you get from that will be lower. So in principle, this alternative is like holding those bank deposits in dollars, but will be cheaper. Will be.
So in your model, the digital economy was another country that issued stable coins, but how about, and I'm getting out of your model now, the central banks that issue digital coins themselves? So they would be in the same circle, so how that...
Yeah, it works. So you're talking the central bank digital currency. I thought a lot about that. I don't have a definitive answer, but in my view, the central bank digital currency is not that different from the typical monetary base. That is what I concluded. There are papers that have been written, maybe they get to a different conclusion, but to me is the same idea. The big issue, of course, is, but I don't think this has been resolved, is whether that central bank digital currency will pay interest. Okay, so the fear is that if they start paying interest, then there will be the disintermediation of the banking sector. Okay, but then at that point, the central bank becomes a commercial bank. So I'm not sure that central banks who will issue the digital currency will pay interest. So then it will work exactly as the monetary base that we have already, right? In fact, if you think about it, the reserves of banks are already digital. Okay, part of the monetary base, of course, are the reserves of banks, right? Well, those are digital already, in some sense. So in my view, the simply issuance of central bank digital currency, provided that the central bank doesn't pay interest, okay, won't make any difference.
Go ahead.
Hi, Vincenzo. One question. So one of these key assumptions, the question is quite simple, is that to operate in the digital economy, you need to have a Bitcoin or...
Sure, a crypto.
A cryptocurrency, sorry. So I don't see that occurring. So what are the cases of transactions that currently you cannot do with your credit card, with your dollar? And is that difference like something that is regulatory or something like deep structural that cannot be avoided? So I don't see what things you can do now with a cryptocurrency that you cannot do with a credit card.
The traditional money. Essentially, payments needs to be made in digital form, right? So the payment means must be digital. You are correct that in some sense a payment with credit card, Venmo or Zelle, in some sense is very similar, right? But there is no anonymity. Remember, you pay with a credit card, people knows who you are. In a decentralized market, you are an operator identified by a number, okay? But unless you are willing to reveal who is behind that number, nobody knows really who you are. Okay, so there are the issue. It's possible, however, that maybe with the central bank digital currency, it's possible that at some point the system might accept that because it's purely a transfer of but the way I think is like, okay, we are in the US, we do transaction paid with dollars, right? We go to Japan, we need a different currency, right? You need to use yen, right? If you want to do day by day transaction. So it's a little bit the same here. If you go now to this third country, which is the digital economy, you need their own currency. Okay, they don't accept. Whether this can be modified eventually, it is possible, but at the moment it's not.
We're running out of time, but I'll abuse my power as a chair to try to ask one question, and please, I'll try to be short. The main mechanism the main story of your paper is that in the end, the dollar end up being benefiting from this. You showed us there are two types of cryptocurrencies, the ones that are backed by US dollars and the ones that are backed by crypto. Is the reason that the US dollar ends up being benefited in your story is because the type of backing that the stable coin gets provides that coin different advantages? And that's why the ones dollar backed end up being better than the other ones, or should I just get deep into the
purely an equilibrium results that we get. A little bit is dependent also on the way we calibrate the model and so on. But fundamentally, it works like this. There are operators that mostly operate in the digital economy. Those are the ones who really the main business is in the digital. Could be those who develop decentralized application and so on and so forth. Okay, so what they do is that they might hold cryptocurrency that are risky, and at the same time hold issue liability, they borrow. Essentially, stable coins is a borrowing, is borrowing, right? Of course, they will do if the cost of issuing stable coins is low, but they want to be compensated for the risk. Okay, so in order for them to issue more and more stable coins, is to have more and more crypto. Okay, and in order to have more and more crypto, you need that the digital economy also expand. Exactly. So in the meanwhile, you trade off basically those two mechanisms, and according to our model and simulation, it happens that it is still dominant, the creation through dollars.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. We'll switch to Maggie now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having us here. The paper I'm presenting today is joint work with Neha Beta, my PhD student sitting over there. We're trying to assess the impacts of generative AI on international service outsourcing. When I arrived a couple of hours ago, I realized the title of the conference is Digital Technologies as Drivers of Growth and Well-Being. So I apologize for this somewhat less encouraging picture. But I promise I'll try to finish my presentation on a more positive note. So in the last couple of years, as we all have experienced, generative AI has caused a lot of concerns about the future of the labor market, especially for digital services. At the same time, it also has led to hope of a productivity leap. However, still relatively little is known about how these technology shifts will affect the international labor markets. So in this paper, we want to zoom into that question, and we want to point out that any potential consequences of such technology shock can be particularly important for developing countries, where service exports are becoming a very important engine of both growth in trade and just economic growth overall. As you can see from this picture that, digitally deliverable services have been growing at a pace that outweighs the growth of manufacturing and the growth of other types of services. So the question we're going to ask is how generative AI will shape international outsourcing in digital services. Okay? To answer that question, we thought it would be helpful to take a minute just to compare generative AI with the earlier technology shocks. Right? We're going to start with technology shocks such as the internet communication technology, how that has affected international trade in services. So when you think about it, right, ICT has lowered communication costs, and that has made it easier for us to move routine tasks to lower wage countries because we can easily monitor and communicate with the operations and activities overseas. So that allows us to really take advantage of the labor cost differences across countries. And then we have the automation, especially robotization. Now the robotization, right, has reduced the comparative advantage of a lot of developing countries that allow firms to save on labor costs because now robots can perform these routine tasks, with a big fixed cost, but relatively low variable cost production. So to some extent, it's actually reducing the incentive to outsource or offshore, production stages to lower cost countries. Now, how is generative AI different? Well, generative AI, it is certainly increasing the productivity. But that kind of productivity improvement is no longer constrained geographically, in the sense that, right, robots, the first adopters of robots usually are the capital abundant countries that are able to afford the automation technologies. But here, right, workers in the US and workers in India can more or less access similarly, right, with similar access to generative AI. And that leads to what we call in the title, automation, right, without borders, unbounded by geography. And that, on the one hand, it compresses the cost advantage of digital service workers in lower cost countries. But on the other hand, it's also making those workers, as well as workers in developed countries, more productive. So the implications for international trade, international outsourcing become a bit ambiguous. Okay? So in this paper, we want to really try to provide some new evidence on the impacts of generative AI on these cross-border task flows. To answer that question, we decided to explore the setting of online labor marketplaces, which has become increasingly vital platform for the sourcing of digital services. And also, a unique advantage of these online labor marketplaces is the availability of really granular, high-frequency labor transaction data that allows us to exploit the patterns, the responses, and adjustments on a real-time basis that are often not available with more aggregate labor market data. Okay? So we collect detailed worker business and micro-task transaction data across 2,700 skill areas to track the granular adjustments. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we need to be able to measure the exposure to generative AI at both skill level worker level and also firm level, right? So we do so by actually exploiting generative AI's own assessment of its own capacity to substitute workers or complement workers in each given skill. We figure if anybody knows their ability to replace workers or complement workers, it must be generative AI itself. Right, I realized I was saying anybody, then I changed it to itself. So just to be clear, right, because it has the meta knowledge across different disciplines that one single human being or one single RA would be difficult to have. And then with that exposure measure, we estimate the impacts of generative AI arrival on not just labor demand, but also labor supply, okay, how workers adjust to that shock by adjusting their skills, obviously how firms respond to the shock by adjusting their labor demand. And then we don't have time for the last part of this, and then we try to quantify the income implications in a simple cell-less model. Just a quick preview of the findings. So not surprisingly, we document a sharp decline in international outsourcing to developing countries. We also looked at developed countries, and we do not find a negative and significant impact on developed countries. So it's primarily felt by the developing country workers. And the magnitude is fairly significant. Okay, it's about 20 to 30%, depending on the indicator you're looking at. At the same time, underneath that aggregate pattern, we are documenting some shifts in labor demand. Even though there is a decline in the volume of jobs demand, but at the same time, firms are shifting towards fewer but higher value jobs. Okay? Average job value, average task value, and average complexity level, and it will become clear later how we measure that, actually increased significantly, even though the total number of jobs has declined. Okay? And the businesses are willing to pay more for the jobs, and they continue to outsource. Now, what about the worker side? We also find that workers don't sit still and just, and try to take care of the impact. There is overall a 23% decrease in number of workers, but the average earnings of those continuing workers actually rose significantly. And how did they manage to do that? That suggests we're not just seeing a simple reallocation of jobs, right? We're actually seeing some preemptive and active skill adaptation. We find some workers who lost demand in their existing core skills actually transitioned into adjacent AI complementary skills. So this is the positive part of the analysis, by the way. And they actually benefit. Those who are able to transition, we actually document earning increases for these workers. Not a whole lot of people, but we do see a subset of workers benefit. Overall, we see this reconfiguration of task flows, both within and across countries, firms, and workers with very asymmetric implications. There is a very fast-growing literature on generative AI. In fact, some people here in the IDB have been doing some great work trying to quantify the impact of generative AI, the exposure to generative AI in Latin American economies. I'm not going to go into these papers in detail. There's quite a series of work looking at occupational exposure to generative AI by using, for example, the ONET data to understand, okay, this occupation needs these many skills and how exposed they are for each occupation. And there's also a growing literature looking at experimentally how exposure to generative AI has changed, their productivity, right, for a given task, for a given occupation like writing, consulting, translation. Okay? We want to take a step further by looking at the actual ex-post effect of generative AI on the international labor market, rather than trying to quantify the future impact or looking at a particular skill area. Okay, so how are we going to do that? So we're going to exploit the setting of online labor marketplaces, as I mentioned earlier, which are becoming increasingly important labor market. And about 12.5% of the global labor force actually participates in online labor marketplaces. And the most job flows go from the developed countries to developing countries. Okay? Now, the the platform we are setting is going to be a leading online labor marketplace with workers in around the world in over 200 territories and countries. Okay? And this is a very unique setting for studying how digital job demand, wages, and workers will adjust in real time, right, in response to technology shock. And these patterns sometimes are not going to be available or visible in aggregate data yet, especially when technology shock is fairly recent. So just to give you an example of the type of job being posted on this labor market platform, and also type of information we can collect, this is a sample job posting from the platform. And you can see, right, we can see who was hiring, right? And in this case, it's not a lot of information, ABC, Japan. So we know the country of the recruiter or the business. And then the type of systems required, Excel macros, right? And then the description of the task. And at the bottom, you will see the types of skills the recruiter is expecting to use, right? And that's going to be important for us because these skills are the 2,700 skills we're going to measure exposure with. Okay, and then you can see the budget provided by the recruiter, the number of bids received, and when the job was posted. And then after the job is completed, then you're gonna see a review by the recruiter, right, by the business, for the worker who completed the task. And you're gonna see the same client, right, and then the review, how they believe the work was done, and then you're going to see how much they actually ended up paying the worker, about $350, right? And how long the work took, about 8 hours. So we're going to use both sets of information to construct, a lot of data, like the number of jobs, the total earnings from the jobs, the hourly wage rate, and the ratings, the quality of the job, and so on. Okay. So the data collection, we are looking at over 2,700 skill areas in about 26 broad categories, and we have collected so far 1.3 million worker skill profiles, accounting for about 95% of all the completed transactions. And for the analysis I'm presenting, we're only looking at 2022 and 2023, though we are trying to add 2024 and part of 2025. And 91% of the transactions are international, because this is a international labor market. And the US is the largest source of hire recruiters, and South Asia is the largest source of suppliers. And you can see the countries, the most popular destinations being India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the biggest buyers are from the United States and Australia. And then the categories show you where the jobs are primarily distributed. Okay, so I already told you the type of information we have. Essentially, we have 3 categories of information. The worker level, from the worker profile. We know the worker name, ID, location, education, certification, experience, their job history, client reviews, and so on. And then for the clients, we don't know a whole lot about the clients, unfortunately, but we do know, we can track them over time. We know where they're from, the industries, the hiring histories, and the ratings they gave. And then at the project level, we know a lot of information. We know, obviously, the skills they need. We know the description, the status, the budget, the number of bids, which is a measure of competition, the payment, and the ratings, and so on. Okay? All right. Now let's move to the right-hand side, right? How do we construct exposure measures, right? So there are quite a few ways to do so, right? You can, right, obviously go around and ask people how exposed do you feel you are to generative AI? How much you feel like your job is at risk, right? So you can do so. The problem is you need to interview people from over 2,700 skill areas, and I don't think I have the budget to do so. So I decided to go the cheaper way, which is to rely on ChatGPT or cloud or other generative AI, because I figured it probably has more, maybe not too deep, but at least very broad knowledge about its own capacity to replace or complement workers across skill areas. Okay, So we construct a skill-specific measure of generative AI exposure, right? As I mentioned, by leveraging ChatGPT's own assessments. And we solicit ratings from 1 to 10 on its perceived capability in either assisting workers or independently performing the skill with very minimum human assistance, right? So you can see what we're trying to get at, complementarity versus substitution. Okay? To mitigate the potential variability, we all know ChatGPT can be a bit moody and unreliable, so we decided to ask ChatGPT 100 times for each of these questions, right? For each skill, we ask ChatGPT many, many times and to try to get a sense about, on average, how ChatGPT, assess itself. And then we construct exposure score at skill level, and then we map it to workers based on the worker's skill profile before ChatGPT arrived, before generative AI arrived, and we map it to businesses based on the skills where they have been recruiting workers, right? And by the way, we are revising our paper and our prompts. So these days, when you revise your paper, you have to revise your prompts. So our baseline prompts are fairly simple, but we are actually now trying to make it more sophisticated. But the gist of it is we're asking, ChatGPT, we're going to give you a skill. Can you tell, and the employer decides not to hire a contractor, but to perform the tasks themselves. Can you tell us how well you can assist the individual in executing the tasks if they opt to utilize your assistance rather than some human being or outsourcing the work, right? So this is that's the assisting score. And then the next score is try to measure the displacement, right? How well do you think you can actually perform the tasks with very minimum human assistance, okay? All right, now I think a lot of you probably are already wondering, are these scores reliable? Don't you think ChatGPT might be overly confident? And the answer is yes, it is very confident, right? And you can see the score distributions are highly skewed, right, with a heavy right tail, right? So it does believe it can displace or replace workers in many areas, and it can also assist workers in many areas, but that's okay, because we don't really care so much about the level of the score itself. What we care more about is the variations across skill areas, right? And we do see variations across skill areas, okay? So the average score, don't worry too much. I mean, what does 7 mean, right? So it's all relative to the other tasks. All right, so another thing I want to say is that the two scores are highly correlated, right? And that's probably not surprising, right? In areas where ChatGPT believes to be able to assist workers are also skill areas, and they might actually replace some workers, okay? And what are those skills, right? I was thankful that I didn't find economic research up there, though it might not be on that platform, probably that's why. But you can see the most exposed skills include Google search. I didn't even know that's actually a skill, but it's listed as the most exposed skill up there, right? And Adobe Photoshop, HTML programming, and that kind of checks our boxes, right? And that makes sense. Those are most exposed skill areas. Though score 1 is assisting, score 2 is displacement. And you can see, right, English spelling, right, and English grammar are more displaceable than the assistable. So, and that makes sense, right? We do become kind of dependent on Grammarly these days, right? And then the least exposed skills, right? There are a bunch of them that don't even know what they mean. But fashion modeling, I do recognize that, right? So that seems to be very very little exposure to generative AI, and that gives us some hope. Okay, so in terms of geographic exposure, right? So we try to construct a country-specific measure of exposure based on the workers active on the platform. Obviously, this is not going to be super representative because we are working with the workforce in our platform. And we find that exposure is notably higher among the workers in emerging economies, perhaps not surprisingly, because those workers are very active on the platform, especially in these exposed skill areas, right? And you see quite a bit of exposure in Latin America as well. Okay, all right, so what do we find? I have 8 minutes to show you what I find. I'm gonna, this is too small. Do we have, okay, let's just look at this then. So this is the impact of exposure or the interaction of exposure score with the arrival of ChatGPT. So this is a different diff, right? On the number of jobs and the value of jobs, I believe, right? So this is, the left-hand side is the value of jobs, and the right-hand side is the number of jobs. The red lines, the red dots are developed countries, and the blue dots are developing countries. And you can see the developing countries have a larger negative impact, okay? So whereas the developed countries are seeing also negative, but not statistically significant impact. So it sounds like, it looks like primarily, at least for now, the impact is felt on this platform mainly by the developing country workers. And then if you look at the share of jobs going to the top workers, right? We want to see, is the impact symmetric, right? What we find is increasing concentration of jobs and earnings on the top workers in each skill areas, okay? So there are a lot of people exiting, there are a lot of people not getting jobs, but the top workers are getting an increasing share of jobs and earnings. All right, now, what about at disaggregated levels? Okay, what's happening to labor demand? Are firms just hiring fewer workers, or are they doing something a little bit different? Well, what you can see here is the left-hand side figure is the number of jobs, and the right-hand side figure is the total value of jobs that continue to be outsourced, right? Obviously, these are the regression results. And what we find, I apologize about the size of the font, what we find is the number of jobs by continuing employers fell, but the total spending was actually increasing, okay? So they are hiring fewer workers, fewer jobs, but they are paying more for the jobs, and they continue to outsource to developing countries, okay? In fact, we also looked at the willingness to pay, because we do know how much they're willing to pay, right? We observe not only how much they end up paying, but also how much they offer to pay. And we find they are willing to pay more, okay? The minimum budget and maximum budget was higher after ChatGPT. Is this hourly? No, project value. So, yeah, it's not hourly, that's a good question. Hourly data is a bit scattered. So we don't have a whole sample reporting hourly wage. They might be bundling jobs, yes. So, I mean, we have to have a good hypothesis why they choose to bundle jobs after ChatGPT, right? So they can post multiple listings, but what we do observe is that they are posting jobs that require more skills. Remember the number of skills they can list at the bottom of the job description? That is increasing. So I don't know whether they are bundling jobs or they are posting more complex jobs. I don't have a good theory why they would want to bundle jobs, because they can just post one job after another. But the jobs they do post become a little bit more inter-skills. Okay, so what about the workers? Do workers do anything at the same time other than losing demand? So what we find is that, yes, they are seeing a decline in the job count, number of jobs, which is the lowest dot, that is declining, okay? And they are also getting a lower total value, okay? But the average value of the jobs they do receive actually has increased in the exposed skill areas, okay? So in fact, the magnitude is fairly significant. For those jobs I continue to get, they are giving me higher pay than before, at least at the project level. Okay. Okay. So another dimension we want to look at the worker level, right? Other than the number of jobs, the value of your jobs, and the average pay of the jobs. What about your productivity? Right. So we do observe the ratings that the workers have, for the jobs that the workers have performed. So we look at how the rated quality of the jobs has changed across skill areas depending on their exposure to generative AI. And what we find is that the workers at the bottom of the rating, right? So the horizontal axis is the pre-GPT, pre-generative AI ratings. okay? The different percentiles of that. And then the vertical axis is the change. What we find is that the workers with the lowest prior quality or ratings actually see a bigger improvement in the quality. Okay, it seems like the generative AI technology access is leveling the playing field a little bit by helping the low-performing workers actually improve their quality of their work. Okay, all right. Now, do they actually do something with their skills? Do they actively adapt their skills to handle the technology shock better? So here we are looking at the worker level again, and we're looking at their skill profile over time. And what we find is that if you look at the orange bar, that suggests that the workers are reducing, or at least they are not getting work in as many skill areas as before. Okay? So the number of skills where they continue to get jobs is declining. But they are at the same time acquiring new skills. Okay? Or at least they are getting work in new skill areas. Okay? And the green one is the existing skills are shrinking. Okay? And then finally, the yellow bar is saying that the average number of skills they utilize per job is increasing. Okay? So you can see there's actually fairly active adaptation by the workers. Okay, they are actually going into new skill domains while shedding some of the old skills they possess. Now, I don't know how I can click that particular dot, but that's okay. So what we find is, so the question is obviously which skills do they go into, right? Which skills do they transition into, right? So in some part of the appendix, we show that they are actually not running away from generative AI. They are actually moving into more exposed skill areas by adapting AI-related skills. Okay? And they're not going far. They're going to adjacent fields. So how do we measure adjacency, proximity? We are looking at the relatedness of every pair of skills based on the frequency of every pair of skills being listed in the same worker profile and required by the same firm. Right? So we try to measure relatedness of the skill pairs, and we find that workers tend to go somewhere close, adjacent, but they do not run away from AI. And they try to integrate AI into their workflow. Okay? And that, oh no, this is actually the slide. And you can see that, right? So we have the two relatedness measures based on the supply side, based on the demand side. And then we have the difference in generative AI exposure. I is a skill I had, J is a skill I go into, and what you find is that I am actually going into a skill where the generative AI exposure is higher than before, okay? Than the skill I'm leaving, okay? And I'm going to the related skills, not something really far away from my competency. Okay, I did promise a positive message, but it's in that blue tab right there. What we find is that those workers who actually transition by acquiring new skills, by shedding, by not just shedding old skills, also transitioning into new skills, they actually see a boost in their earnings. Okay, all right. I think I finished the presentation perfect time, and this is a summary of our results. But since this is IDB, I do want to put out some policy messages out there. And I'm, of course, not trying to give us specific suggestions, but I think we need to start by proactively monitoring and managing the generative AI's implications, especially for developing countries. And I think we are, in urgent need for some targeted interventions in the most exposed skill areas. I'll stop right here.
Thank you very much, Maggie. We are a bit behind in time, but we may have time for one question. If nobody wants to ask, I have one question. But please ask them there at the microphone stand.
Fascinating, very interesting paper. Finally, somebody has done this work. But Eric Brynjolfsson and company have just put out a paper, similar thing, based on Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US about 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago. And I was wondering if if there's any fundamental difference in your findings and what they came up with. Because they're very, they took the granular approach and have done pretty much similar stuff, but only for the US. And I'm wondering if there's any difference between the two.
So there are a couple of papers coming out, some by the Indeed Hiring Lab and some by IDB and so on. So I think there is a fundamental difference in the research in terms of the types of labor markets we're looking at. Obviously, the paper is international, but more than that, we are looking at the types of relationships that are short-term and flexible. So that means any impacts we see in this research probably are going to be the upper bound for now, because those contracts are, very easy to terminate. They are contracts and they're not permanent employment, right, or regular employment. So I think there is some difference. And obviously, we're looking at the cross-border task flows, which have a lot of implications for developing countries.
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Maggie. We now will move on to Divya. We'll ask more questions to Maggie after the final presentation and during the break.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having this paper on the program for this very interesting conversation. This is joint work with Alex and Sole, my colleagues at the IMF, and Yao, who's at Wharton. And the usual institutional disclaimer applies. These are our own views and shouldn't be associated with anyone else at the IMF. Okay, so money and payments are fundamental economic technologies for which network effects are really critical, right? So the value of any particular payments technology for me really depends on how many other people use that technology. Our starting point for this paper is the observation that these network effects create a dilemma from the perspective of payment system design. So on one hand, payment systems can be set up in a way that maximizes network size for particular technologies. So as many users as possible coordinate on particular technologies. And that kind of setup might mean very limited choice for users and some platforms or providers being dominant. On the other hand, payment systems can be set up in a way that maximizes a wide and diverse range of options, lots of entry from new providers, but that kind of system might come with a lot of fragmentation, making it difficult for any of these particular technologies to really get off the ground. We think this dilemma is particularly relevant now because there's been a whole wave of innovation in the space of payments, certainly in the last couple of decades, and that it's relevant very broadly within payments. So it's relevant for domestic payments, right? It's relevant for emerging market countries that are thinking about introducing new payment platforms and thinking about how to get them off the ground, but also relevant much more broadly. So, policymakers in the US, China, UK, Europe have all expressed concerns about their payment systems along these lines. And it's also relevant, so that's domestic payments. We think this dilemma is also relevant for the case of cross-border payments, where there's a whole wave of initiatives to modernize in the space that don't necessarily connect with each other. And so the future of cross-border payments might also be highly fragmented. And finally, perhaps this is relevant more broadly, as there is at least more discussion of the possibility that the currency paradigm going forward might be more multipolar and therefore more fragmented. In this paper, we're going to ask whether it's possible to avoid fragmentation in payment markets while still maintaining choice for users. And let's start with a very simple example to get concrete quickly. Let's imagine that there are two users and they would like to make a transaction with each other, and user one likes platform A. Let's take a US example, so maybe they like Zelle, and user two likes platform B, right? So maybe they like Venmo. And if it's not possible to make transactions across these payment platforms, there's fragmentation. And these users might then decide that they don't want to use digital payments at all, and they might use some outside option like cash. In this paper, we're going to consider the possibility that these two platforms, A and B in this example, become connected, that it becomes possible to seamlessly make transactions across these platforms. And that's what we're going to mean by interoperability. And we can see in this example that that would remove fragmentation while still maintaining choice. right? So these two users could then make their transaction with each other, but they could still also pick the platform that they like. So we're going to begin the paper with a simple, with a stylized conceptual framework, which is going to make 2 points. The first of these we've just seen in the very simple example, which is that interoperability can unlock gains by connecting previously fragmented payment networks. The second point, somewhat more subtle, is that the introduction of interoperability brings larger gains where payment markets are more fragmented to begin with. And we'll get into the intuition for why. Then we're going to take this conceptual framework to the data using some really unique data that will allow us to empirically get at the importance of interoperability. And what's really nice about this data set is that we're going to observe 2 large digital payment networks that initially operated separately and then became interconnected with each other. They became integrated with each other through interoperability. And so you can see that tightly connects with the example that we just looked at. And then we're going to exploit regional variation, as you would expect based on the conceptual framework, in the extent of ex-ante fragmentation in payment markets. And what that's going to let us do is observe an empirical counterfactual within this country, within the same country, for what would happen with either less or no interoperability. Finally, we're going to put together the conceptual framework and the data to learn and to kind of get to the conclusion that interoperability overall seems quite important. So as a result of the integration of these 2 payment networks, we estimate that total digital payments, we're going to be working in the setting of India, total digital payments in India grew by more than 50% just in the following year. Right? So interoperability seems to have a large impact on digital payments. To briefly take you through the literature and the contribution, I won't belabor this. Obviously, there's a long and large literature on money and payments. And relative to that literature, we show that interoperability shapes this trade-off that I began with between maintaining network benefits between any particular payments technology and maintaining choice for users across technologies. There's actually not that much work, we think, on interoperability when it comes to payments. But there is some, and this work has largely focused on the impact of interoperability on the supply of payments-related technologies. And we are going to work in a very nice empirical setting where, at least in the short term, we'll be able to shut those down. And what we're going to show is that interoperability has a large impact on the demand for digital payments. And again, in thinking about that, we're going to be able to use this very nice within-country empirical counterfactual. The literature on, this literature has often had to make comparisons across countries, and while the work is obviously nice, cross-country comparisons have their limitations. There's a much broader literature on network technologies and the adoption of network technologies. And the kind of broader point from this work is that the introduction of interoperability acts like an amplifier of the strategic complementarities that are so important for getting any particular technology going off the ground. Finally, within the context of India, we're going to show that interoperability is a big part of the story for why digital payments took off and the kind of benefits that one might get from those downstream. Okay, so now I'll take you through the context and present some important stylized facts. Then we'll get to the conceptual framework, our empirical results, and some wider implications. Okay, so we're going to be working in the setting of digital payments in India and focusing on this very interesting platform, the Unified Payments Interface. So now, before UPI was launched, there were other firms, including one fintech firm that offered an important closed-loop digital payment platform. Right? So users that wanted to make payments both had to be on that platform. When UPI was launched, a kind of key feature of that was that it was designed to be interoperable, in that it allowed for seamless payments across any payment providers participating on this platform. Now, part of what makes UPI an interesting setting to study in for other countries that are thinking about growing digital payments is that this is now the world's largest fast payment system. So just last month, it processed 20 billion transactions, and so it's an example of fintech at scale. Just to see a little bit of this transformation visually, kind of in under a decade, digital payments have really taken off in India. And at the same time, it appears to be the case that the use of cash has declined. Now, most of this growth in digital payments comes from this interoperable system, UPI. And kind of really tellingly, most of the transactions on UPI are cross-app. So for most transactions on UPI, users, the person making the payment and the person receiving the payment actually do choose two different apps. Right? So strongly suggestive that interoperability had an important role to play, but obviously not in itself either a causal statement or a quantitative statement. And we want to make progress with both of those. Okay, so now our conceptual framework. We're going to present a stylized model in which users are going to make choices across different payment options. And specifically, they're going to choose between two digital payment platforms, A and B, and an outside option, cash. Now, users are going to vary in two different ways on two dimensions. The first of these, for the pictures that are coming, this is the vertical dimension. Users are going to vary in how much they like cash, reflecting, for example, differences in demographics, right? So there's evidence that younger people are more open to digital payments, or perhaps the perceived benefits of informality. The second dimension on which users are going to vary, and this will be the horizontal dimension, is users are going to vary in how they evaluate these two digital payment platforms, A and B. So some users are only going to consider platform A, and some users are only going to consider platform B, reflecting, for example, differences in brand familiarity or preferences for specific features offered by one or the other platform. Now, importantly, the convenience that users are going to derive from being one or the other of these platforms will depend on how many users are on that platform. Right? So that is to say that there will be network effects. And if we begin with the case without interoperability, what that means is that users are going to care about how many other users are on the same platform as them. So let's start by looking at how equilibrium works in this model without interoperability. And the key point here is that there's fragmentation in payment markets. Right? So users will care about how many other users are on the same platform as them. And importantly, there are going to be some cross-platform network benefits that will remain unrealized. So what happens when interoperability is introduced? Right? The key implication of that is that users will now be able to reach anyone that's on either platform. Right? So cross-platform network benefits will be unlocked. And what that does is that it makes both digital platforms more useful, and more users are drawn to adopting digital payments, and they substitute away from cash. Right? So interoperability drives more adoption of digital payments because it unlocks more cross-platform network benefits. Turning then to the second point we make with the conceptual framework, a little bit more subtle. If we compare different payment markets, where would we expect interoperability to bring larger gains? So on your left, you see a market that is more fragmented, and on your right, you see a market that's less fragmented. And the key point here is that on the left, there are more unrealized network benefits, whereas on the right, the more everyone is concentrated towards one platform anyway, the less it is that there are unrealized cross-platform network benefits. And so immediately what we see from that is that introducing interoperability brings larger gains because it unlocks larger cross-platform network benefits in markets that are more fragmented to begin with. And that'll be very helpful when we take this conceptual framework to the data. Okay, so how are we going to take this to the data? Again, what's really neat and unique about the data that we're going to be working with is that we are going to observe two large payment networks, both when they were in existence separately and after they became connected through interoperability. Right? So tightly connecting with this conceptual framework that we saw. And so as part of that, we're going to observe all activity on this interoperable platform, UPI. With a lot of geographic granularity, we'll be able to see this at the district level. And importantly, we'll be able to see the apps that are on both sides of transactions. Right? So intuitively, that'll be very important for thinking about interoperability. We're also going to be able to observe with similar granularity what happens on the payment, on the network run by this important major fintech incumbent. And finally, we will also have data for a proxy for cash with the same granularity. Okay. Now, our empirical specification is going to be tightly connected with the conceptual framework. We're going to basically be running basically a diff and diff, and we're going to compare districts where there was more fragmentation in payment markets initially to districts where there was less fragmentation in payment markets to begin with. And again, the intuition from the conceptual framework is that in the places where there was more fragmentation, there are more unrealized cross-platform network benefits, and therefore we expect adoption to grow more in those places. Now, importantly, this integration event took place because of a regulatory mandate, so we're not concerned about anticipation effects. And we do several things to make sure that the comparison embedded in the diff and diff is a sensible one. So we're going to have state by time fixed effects. So we're only going to be comparing districts within the same state. And we're going to control for the ex-ante level of adoption of digital payments. Right? So in our comparison of more versus less fragmented districts, we're only going to be using variation in the initial composition across these two payment networks. So across the incumbent and UPI. We're not going to be using variation in the overall adoption of digital payments. Now, when we do all of that, importantly, we don't find any evidence of pre-trends. Right? So before the integration event, we don't see any difference between these groups of districts and the adoption of digital payments. After these two payment networks connected through interoperability, in the places where there was more fragmentation to begin with, where, again, our conceptual framework tells us there are more unrealized cross-platform network benefits, those are the places where we see a sharp increase in the adoption of digital payments. Now, very consistent with the conceptual framework, what we also observe is not just an increase in the adoption of digital payments, but also growth in digital payments relative to the use of cash. Right? So very consistent with the conceptual framework, we find evidence that this integration made digital payments more useful and drove substitution away from cash. Okay. Now, to explain a little bit of the color that's in the paper around this main result in several dimensions, we can think about where this growth came from. So again, also consistent with the conceptual framework, most of the growth was actually driven by new users being attracted to digital payments. Right? So more people were attracted to digital payments because they became more useful. Although we do also see that these users made more and larger transactions. Now, another way to think about what happened as a result of this integration of these two payment networks is that users liked the combined network more than the sum of its parts. And we see that in the data. So we see, of course, that there were more transactions, there were significant transactions between these two payment networks, which were not possible without interoperability. But we also see that each network individually became more useful and was used more as well. Now, to say a little bit about identification, as we saw, our baseline already shows no evidence of differential pre-trends, and the high and low fragmentation districts are similar on a range of observables. But we can sharpen that by explicitly matching on observables. And when we do that, we find very similar results. The other dimension that I want to push on is you might be thinking, well, why was there variation in fragmentation in payment markets to begin with? Why was it that in some cases the incumbent fintech firm had a higher share relative to UPI than in others? Now, here we can use some very interesting variation, which relates to the fintech firm's decisions well in advance of this integration of its marketing strategy. So it chose some hubs in deciding where to grow, and we can use distance to those hubs as a way to get at why there was variation. So in the places that were close to those hubs, the incumbent fintech firm had larger market shares, and those were places with more fragmentation. So we can use the incumbent's marketing strategy determined well in advance of this as an instrument. And again, the results remain very similar. There are a number of additional results in the paper that I won't get into, but of course I'd be happy to discuss. Okay, so now turning to some wider implications from this, we think of our evidence in the cross-section, comparing districts with more or less fragmentation, as providing sharp empirical evidence on the importance of interoperability. At the same time, that empirical evidence doesn't directly speak to an aggregate impact of interoperability, because that requires us to solve the missing intercept problem. Now, to make progress here, we're going to, again, draw on our theory to bring some more insights to the table. And the key point here is that if there's no fragmentation to begin with, there are no gains to be had from interoperability. right? If everyone's already on one platform, making other platforms available is not that useful. Then we can empirically take the places that had very little fragmentation to begin with to offer an empirical counterfactual for what would happen without interoperability. And we can take that counterfactual and look at digital payments adoption everywhere relative to that counterfactual and aggregate that up. And when we do that, what we find, so our kind of overall estimate, is that total digital payments in India grew by more than 50% just in the subsequent year as a result of this integration of these two payment networks. Right? So overall, interoperability seems quite important. Okay. Now, part of the reason that there's so much excitement about digital payments is that they bring other benefits beyond having just digital payments grow. And one of these is the ability to unlock new kinds of lending opportunities. And we do see a little, this is not the focus of our paper, but we do see a little bit of evidence along those lines here. So on the left, you have just a descriptive association that in the places where there's more digital payments activity, households are more likely to borrow from non-banks. It's the kind of financial institutions that are well placed to draw on the new data that's generated by digital payments. On the right, we see the same natural experiment and the same kind of diff and diff comparison that we saw for the adoption of digital payments. And what we see is that in the places where there was more fragmentation in payments markets to begin with, right, more unrealized cross-platform network benefits and more growth in digital payments, in those places, we also see that households started to being more likely to borrow from non-banks. Right? Again, the kind of lending activity that you would expect to see with more digital payments. Okay. Finally, our empirical and conceptual approach largely focus on the impact of interoperability on the demand for digital payments. And that's because we're working in this very interesting setting where in the short term, we can hold lots of considerations related to supply fixed, in part because the infrastructure was provided publicly. Now, we do know from the wider literature on interoperability that there could be effects on supply in the longer term, and that those might be ambiguous, right? So it could be that interoperability kind of encourages providers to make investments together, or that there's more of a kind of free rider effect. What we want to highlight here is that in this setting, we see something else in addition to that going on that's also interesting, which is that providers seem to be making actions that seem to be designed to erode interoperability and make it more difficult for users to freely switch across providers. And so that suggests that to really have interoperability, in addition to the initial policy choice of whether to have that or not, there might be an ongoing role for policy. Okay, so I'm happy to chat about any of that as we go along. So in summary, again, money and payments are fundamental technologies that are also really network technologies. And this creates a dilemma from the perspective of payment system design between maintaining network benefits within any particular technology or platform and allowing for choice for users across technologies. And as we discussed, this is very relevant for domestic payments in most countries. It's relevant for emerging markets that are thinking about how to launch new kinds of payment technologies and really get them off the ground. And it's relevant in advanced economies as well. It's relevant for cross-border payments, where there are many different initiatives to modernize that might not connect with each other. And so the future of cross-border payments might have a lot of fragmentation. And finally, it's potentially also relevant to the extent that the currency paradigm going forward is more multipolar and more fragmented. And the evidence we present in this paper, the conceptual and empirical evidence, speaks to all of these settings, right? It shows that bringing together large existing payment networks has a significant impact on the demand for digital payments, right? And is therefore relevant in this very wide set of settings. I'll stop here and happy to chat more.
Thank you very much, Divya. So in the interest of fairness, we'll take one more question and then we'll take a break. Is there anybody who has a question for Divya? Julian? Yeah, we'll let you ask both.
Let's only ask for that one. So, no, I just wanted to ask you, like, what is the, in a way, what would be the rationale for not doing interoperability in the short run? It's like, what is the theoretical reason that doesn't it seems like, yes, like obvious in a way. So what's the point in a way? Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. If we think about each of the settings that I started with, right? If you look at if you think about just domestic payments, right? There, the potential reason not to think about interoperability is that there might be longer term effects on supply that are not clear, right? So there is some interesting evidence on mobile payments from Africa where the introduction of interoperability had some negative effects. And that's because in the case of Africa, a lot of the infrastructure was actually mobile towers where there are large variable costs. So they're kind of operated by fuel, and when interoperability reduced rents, providers kind of scaled down their investment in this infrastructure. That was not relevant in this setting, and this is what I meant by saying that we are in a setting where we can shut that down, right? Because the infrastructure was provided publicly. So now sticking with the theme of your question, you might think that interoperability is a no-brainer, kind of conceptually. The simple example that I started with, right, clearly it can only help. What's not clear is how much it can help. And that's why the kind of empirical evidence here, I think, is helpful. More broadly, if we think about cross-border payments, I think there are a whole range of reasons why different initiatives might not end up connecting with each other, that I think, including geopolitics. Right? So if you think about different countries that are stakeholders in different initiatives for cross-border payments, they may not want all of them to connect with each other. Nevertheless, what this evidence shows is that there is a cost to that fragmentation.
Thank you very much. Unless you want to ask your question to Maggie, we can take a break and you can ask her on the one. There's another question. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hola a todos.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. We've been discussing many different topics today. We've been listening to the panelists. I work at a bank in my country where there's a challenge, which is financial inclusion. We're still dealing with that. And it's a situation that we can find in many different parts of the world today. And thinking about what you've been sharing with us, I see many challenges, also many potential benefits. Maggie, you were talking about an impact on value creation as these
Gracias. Pero gracias. Más que una
Thank you anyway. More than a question, or rather than a question, it's just some thoughts I've had. And since we're at the IDB, I think we need to talk about the technology gap, educational gap, capacity building gaps that exist among different countries and how we need to help with that. Maybe you can help me translate this for the panelists. Are we considering providing some help to developing countries, some knowledge transfer to help them start closing these gaps and helping out entities that might provide some of these benefits to marginalized communities by providing them access to technologies, including internet access for some of them, so that we can achieve that financial inclusion and penetration that we're after?
Observation. I'll explain to you guys on the coffee break, and the next panel that's coming up is will also touch on some of these topics. Thank you very much to all of our three panelists, and thank you for this great set.